We're live, Alexander.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well. Sorry to be slightly late today, but I'm extremely well and delighted to be on our programs, as always.
Our last program of the year.
Last program of the year. And I'm going to say this. I think 2021, as we're going to discover, has been a critically important year. It's obviously critically important for the United States, which is the main country in the world. Despite what people say, it's still the pivotal country. It's important for the world because it's the year when we see the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership fully consolidate and start to exert itself and, throw its weight around, if you like. It's important for Europe because we've seen the further symptoms of decay. And I'm going to say a lot more about that because that's now having a geostrategic significance. And of course, there's changes in the world economy, changes in the way social systems work, all sorts of things. All of that is happening. So 2021 is going to be seen as an important year, a pivotal year. And just before I came onto this program, I was reading the latest White House briefing on the conversation between Putin and Biden that's happening later today. And the thing that really stood out for me was how incredibly conciliatory towards the Russians the administration is being. I mean, they've had all these extraordinary demands from the Russians, and they're not rejecting them outright. They're saying, oh, yeah, fine, let's talk about them. These are important topics of discussion. Let's debate them. Let's inquire about them. They were asked about the new Ukrainian peace plan, which the Ukrainians have cooked up in cooperation with the Germans and the French. I said, oh, yeah, we've seen this peace plan. We think it's interesting. We think it's good. But, we don't make the mistake of thinking that we support it in any way. It's not for us to support anything like that. And I mean, it's a dramatic change of tone. And you can see how the unelected apparatchiks in Europe, the ideologues, people like Josep Borrell, Jens Stoltenberg, are becoming really angry and really concerned, and they're feeling that things are not working out as they'd expected, and they also sense that Europe is being marginalized. So US is still making the big moves. I mean, let's be quite clear about that. In spite of all its problems, all its divisions, it remains a superpower. It continues to have agency, even with a weak, disorganized administration. It's still able to do things which its European allies cannot do. And at the same time, the Europeans sense that, the tectonic plates are shifting and they just don't know what to do about it. And they're very angry about it, but they feel increasingly marginalized. So this has been a critically important year in that respect, critically important in the US as well, because we see the project of what I'm going to start referring to as our democracy, which is to say the democracy of the Democratic Party, the progressive wing, all those people, which is, to be quite clear about it, it has nothing to do with democracy. Anyway, that's all starting to come apart. It's coming apart at the wheels. And at the same time, as I said, we see actions happening all around the world, which point to a major strategic shift. So I predict 2022 will see more of the same. And at the end of it all, in a couple of years' time, we'll see three great powers: Europe, America, Russia, China. They will be interacting with each other. Europe will be marginalized. It will fall, I suspect, into further decline. And we'll see how that works out in the world.
All right. Yeah, well, the EU is pretty useless. So
absolutely. Good. Absolutely.
They deserve to be marginalized.
Absolutely.
Bunch of bullies.
Absolutely. A very interesting fact also, by the way, talking about the EU, is that the really important country in the EU always is Germany. And it's very interesting to see that the German government has now sent a top advisor to Chancellor Scholz to Moscow to try to establish some kind of communications channel with the Russians through Dmitry Kozak, who is one of Putin's key advisors. Notice how this completely cuts out the Greens, Annalena Baerbock, and people like that. So somebody in Germany is beginning to twig to all of this, and that they're circumventing, or at least there's an attempt in Germany by someone both to circumvent the Greens, who are, of course, hardline Euro fanatics, and, of course, the EU bureaucracy as well. So that would not be happening except, with these larger tectonic plates, which we're talking about, starting to shift.
All right. Okay, everybody hit that like on the way in. Welcome to this live stream. Everybody from Locals as well. We got a chat open up on Locals. So welcome to everybody who is watching us via Locals. And we've got people, Alexander, from all over the world. This is our final live stream of 2021. We decided to do it on a Thursday once again instead of Friday. Tomorrow we'll be celebrating the end of what really was a terrible year.
Absolutely.
But it's over, and we're going to look forward to 2022. So in this show, Alexander will just take people's questions about 2022, what they would like to ask us, what they're predicting, and we can just have an open conversation about 2022. And I'll jump into the super chats and read questions. I'll jump into Locals and read questions, and I'll go into the live stream as well and just read questions. And for the first topic, though, that we do have to cover is we have to cover the Ghislaine verdict. Before we do that, Alexander, let's say hello to our awesome moderators. We have got GEC in the house. GEC 812 is with us, and I believe I saw Alan Watson in the house as well. And who else is with us? Let me just do a quick scan here. Yes, Alan Watson is also with us, helping to moderate. And I think that is, I think that's it, right? Did I miss one of the moderators? No, GEC 812 and Alan Watson are here helping to keep the chat moving along. And we also have a couple super chats, Alexander, that we'll get to. And let's do this. Let's talk about the Ghislaine verdict.
Yeah.
And then we'll do some super chats, and then we'll get into 2022 and just take questions, just to kind of have an open conversation. So once again, greetings to everyone. I'm seeing people from Serbia, from Ireland, from the UK, from the USA, from Sweden, from Australia, from New Zealand, Netherlands. Just a really great turnout. So smash that like. Indonesia is with us as well. South Africa, Sydney, awesome. Argentina, great to have you with us from Argentina. Alexander Ghislaine is guilty on 5 of 6 counts. I would just like to say that we did a show with Robert Barnes about 2 weeks ago, maybe? 2 weeks ago. And Robert, if you are watching this live stream, my friend, you called this one perfectly.
Absolutely.
So big up to Robert Barnes. Absolutely. He called it cabining. They're going to put a cabin over it, this case, and they're just going to kind of, usher Ghislaine into some prison and just, what's done is done. Nothing to see here. Everyone move along. And we have it. Guilty.
We have it.
Going to be carted off to some federal prison, I imagine, and that'll be that.
And that'll be that.
And everything else will be, because there's a lot of names that we would like to know about, but
we're not going to know anything about any of them. Now, Robert Barnes, who is, of course, a brilliant US lawyer, a trial attorney in the United States, he has a tremendous instinct for these things. He called it exactly. I mean, it's eerie to see how it turned out. And of course, he was talking about this before the trial took place. A 10-day trial, 10 days for a case of this kind, for a case of such crimes of such enormous scope. I mean, that's ludicrous. That's absolutely ridiculous. A defense that barely functioned. I mean, when she presented, when her lawyers, who she's paid apparently $7 million to spoke out and set out their defense. I mean, I was just tearing my hair. What defense? I mean, it wasn't even an attempt at a coherent defense. The whole thing was ludicrous. It was exactly, as you said, as Robert Barnes said, an attempt to close the book on an affair. And by the way, interestingly, it's been picked up in Britain as well. I was reading last night an article in The Guardian, about as establishment as it gets, about as fervidly as establishment as it gets. And it talks, that article, with some degree of bemusement about the fact that Prince Andrew is barely mentioned throughout the whole trial. His name barely came up. And of course, nor did anybody else's. People were touched upon briefly. Few names were mentioned in passing, but nothing. We know nothing more about the whole Maxwell Epstein scandal than we did before this trial began. And bear in mind, what is a trial? A trial is supposed to be an investigation. Obviously, one is looking to establish the guilt or innocence of the defendant. But the whole nature of justice is the justice is supposed to be open. It is supposed to be clear. It is not supposed to leave around piles upon piles of unanswered questions. And a proper trial would have been a trial of Ghislaine, definitely, obviously, but also a trial of her co-conspirators, her co-accused, people of that sort, of whom there would have been, let's face it, many of them. And instead, it's all about that bad man, Epstein, that bad woman, Ghislaine. And to be very clear, I'm not for one moment saying that she's not guilty as charged. She clearly is. And I think, the way the case turned out makes that abundantly clear. I mean, there was no coherent defense to speak of, but it was just down to two people. They, by themselves, essentially did everything all by themselves. There was no other co-conspirators. There were no collaborators. There was no one else involved in any material or significant way. It was all these two bad people indulging themselves for some mysterious reason. We've had no evidence about, how this whole operation really works. Nothing. And everybody else, all the people who we know must have been involved, they're all completely in the clear. They're not going to be investigated. They can go away, live their lives, do all the things that they've been doing. And of course, they've come away scot-free.
Yeah. Do you get the feeling that we've been played on this, Alexander? I mean, they grab Epstein, they put him in the prison, they self-delete him, or maybe they deleted him, self-deleted, they deleted him, whatever. They delete him, throw him in the trash, delete him, he's gone. And then they nab Maxwell somewhere in New Hampshire. She's hanging out at a home in New Hampshire. Yeah. They nab her, do this nice trial. Guilty, great, guilty. And now she goes to prison, and that's that. I mean, this is really, really clean. Very surgical, everything.
It's so surgical that it begs a whole number of questions. I mean, why did the defense put up such a feeble showing? I mean, they did have legal arguments. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, they could have argued, I think, far more effectively that, Ghislaine was covered by that deal that Maxwell made with that prosecutor down in Florida, or whoever it was. I mean, they could have argued that. They didn't really argue it. They could have implicated other people, and that would have been the really powerful thing to do. They could have said she was not just the victim of Epstein, but the victim of all kinds of other powerful people.
Well, she was. Well, kids were. I mean,
yeah,
they were.
Absolutely, yeah. But
I mean, no. I'm sorry to cut you off, but as you're making that point, Alexander, I mean, is it not true from a legal perspective that Ghislaine, yes, found guilty, but she was introducing these girls to people? Yeah. Who are these people? I mean, these people did commit a crime, did they not?
Well, of course they did. Of course they did. Exactly. That's exactly what should have happened. And that begs the question, why did the defense not take that part? Given that they were trying to represent Ghislaine as some kind of victim in this, which, I mean, it's a ludicrous defense, but at least it's a defense. I mean, that would have been a defense, saying that, she was a damaged person. She'd had all these problems with her relationship with her father. You notice she didn't even give evidence. She didn't even put herself in the stand where questions could have been asked of her. Not that the prosecution seemed to be under any, compulsion to ask her questions. But instead, we get this, as you said, incredibly clean, neat closing of the book on the whole affair. And, if I was a suspicious man, which perhaps I am in some ways, but I'm not quite sure how it would have been done, but I would have said some kind of a deal was done. But whether...
Elaborate on that?
This is it. I'm not quite clear what kind of a deal, but I mean, how do
What are you thinking?
organize? Well, that there wasn't some sort of quiet discussions behind the scenes that, we will deal with the trial in this kind of way. We'll close it down in the way that we can. And in the event that it goes the way that we want it to, well, Ghislaine will be parked away in some place or other, some place of detention, but she'll have perhaps better treatment than she might otherwise have done. And if, on the contrary, this thing is really defended vigorously, then it will be very, very tough for her and very, very tough for the lawyers who try to defend her. In other words, they would find that taking that kind of line would be a career-destroying experience.
Gotcha.
That's. I mean, I just to be clear about this, I don't know that is what happened. I want to stress this is just speculation. But how do you conduct how do you control a trial like that?
Yeah.
I mean, there must be some element, I would have thought, of cooperation. Collusion, if you want to use a stronger word.
Well, there are a lot of very powerful, very wealthy people who are just really smiling right now.
Absolutely. Well,
they probably went to sleep last night and they said, life is good. What a great year 2021 was for us.
Yeah,
that's what they said.
That
is exactly what they said.
From their point of view, I mean, the whole story of Ghislaine is bizarre. I mean, the fact that she stayed in the United States, as there was a supposed hunt for her all over the world, and she was in the United States all along in this. And the idea, of course, that the US authorities didn't know where she was is ludicrous. She's called in. I can't help but think when you said we've been played, that's exactly what this looks like. It looks like every move has been choreographed. I don't know how it was done. I don't know by whom, but this doesn't feel like a real trial. It doesn't feel like a real case. Let me reiterate again about Ghislaine's guilt and about the correctness of the verdict. About that, I have no doubt whatsoever. But about the way in which this whole thing was run, that leaves a very, very unsatisfactory taste. There's so many unanswered questions. Can I just make a few further points? We still don't know anything about Epstein himself. I mean, he remains the man of mystery that he always was. Now, I'm somebody who, as a result of things, work I had to do. I mean, I've had some connection with people who've owned money, and I know people in the business world. And I asked recently of someone I know, somebody who works in asset management, because Epstein's fortune when he died was $500 million. But I mean, he owned one of the biggest, most expensive mansions in Manhattan. And you got to understand that the property taxes on a property like that are just off the scale. He owned a private jet. He owned a ranch. He owned a massive apartment in Paris.
He owned an island.
And he owned an island. How can you run? And bear in mind, the $500 million that we're talking about includes the value of all of these properties. You need a huge amount of money to operate, to run effective, and an art collection, by the way. And he bought all the phony fake art that billionaires buy nowadays, art which you wouldn't recognize as art. I know that because I know your tastes. It's not art at all. But he bought all, it costs off the scale. So he was spending money on a titanic scale, far more money than his cash reserves and his shares could have generated. So he must have had income streams about which we know nothing. I mean, I think he had a Boeing 727 or something like that. I mean, old aircraft, but still fairly big one. Operating a private jet on that scale is an expensive thing. I mean, the aviation fuel, the pilots, keeping the thing maintained. I mean, it all builds up. So how do you do it on the kind of assets and cash that he has declared? It can't be done. An island in the Caribbean. I mean, I've checked out the cost of these things. I found an island in the Caribbean on sale, similar one, about $80 million just to buy. I mean, that, of course, again, doesn't include the cost of maintaining it, the staff you have to have there, the insurance costs that come with operating a place like this. It can't be done. The figures just don't add up. So who is he? What was going on? Where did his money come from? How was he financing all of this? And bear in mind, he was giving away money. He gave Ghislaine $30 million. He gave Ghislaine $30 million. What for, by the way? I mean, again, we never really got a clear explanation for this. And that was only some of the money he was giving, because he was giving money to universities, to institutions. It is impossible. The figures just don't add up. He was living a billionaire lifestyle, though he was not supposedly a billionaire.
Yeah. Only governments have that type of money.
Well, governments, or members of the stratospheric oligarchy. I mean, the people, Bill Gates, who was a friend of Epstein's, by the way, people like Bill Gates, I mean, they can afford this kind of thing. I mean, some of the tech billionaires, some of the Wall Street financiers, people who are billionaires, they can live like this. Epstein was not a billionaire, at least not according to the figures that we've been given. So how did he do it?
On a school teacher's salary. He was a school teacher.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well,
they're paying well at the New York schools.
Well, I don't absolutely. So how did he do it? How did he achieve? How did he fund this lifestyle? I mean, as I said, there must have been other income streams. What were they?
You know what it reminds me of? On a totally
and not just other income. They must have been very big income streams.
Like when you watch a James Bond movie, and James Bond has, I mean, he's a spy, but he has he stays at the best hotels, the best homes, has the best cars, the best everything, right? The best gadgets, all of it. Yeah. I mean, he lives a billionaire's life. Yeah. Right. But he's just your average 007, right? Exactly. He's your average spy, but he's given all these things. That's anyway. I'll leave it there. That's how I look at it.
On a British civil servant salary, which is just preposterous. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the same. I mean, he lives. Epstein was living a lifestyle like that and more. Because at least Bond has as a single apartment in London. But I mean, this anyway. I mean, it's ludicrous. Nothing about Epstein makes any sort of sense. I mean, in terms of the information we've been given. I mean, you can speculate about all kinds of other things going on. And I mean, there's all sorts of speculations. But the point is that this trial was supposed to be the place where we were going to get the answers. Well, we're not going to get the answers. That's absolutely clear.
No, and I'll make a prediction going forward. 5, 10, 20 years. I don't know. They say she's going to probably get, this is what I've heard from some analysts. She'll probably get like 15, 20 years, somewhere in the middle of the 65 which is the maximum. They'll probably give her like 20.
Yeah.
10 years when no one's going to be thinking about this anymore, and it's gone down the memory hole. She'll either be deleted or she'll walk out, and that'll be that. I mean,
agreed. Absolutely. I mean, it's the end, and it's the end of the story. I mean, I would say that, of course, I strongly suspect that it won't be completely forgotten. I mean, it's the sort of thing that people do remember. But at the sort of folk level, if you like, and maybe we'll get the old novel, book about this, and people might talk about this, and there'll be all the kinds of speculations, but nothing anywhere close to the truth.
Yeah, well, our oligarch digital overlords in the future won't let us talk about it.
No.
If we talk about Alexander, they'll ding us on the social credit app that they're all putting us under.
Indeed. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to say about this verdict, and we'll wrap it up there. I mean, look forward to 2022.
Just to reiterate again, she is guilty. The verdict itself is, in my opinion, after what we saw at the trial, it's the correct verdict. But I mean, a trial is not just supposed to be a verdict, and a proper trial of this wouldn't just have been Maxwell in the dock. There would have been a whole lot of other people as well.
Yeah.
There we go.
Why are 20,000 files sealed? Yeah, they're sealing everything. Did you ever see the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, Alexander?
Yeah, of course I did.
Remember the end of that movie? They take the complete end. Everything is said and done, right? It just pans to a scene where they're in the warehouse and they put the Ark in a box, put the nails on the box, and you just see, they're carting off the Ark, and it's just, being put with all these other files and folders. That's what's happening. They're going to put everything in a folder, seal it up. It'll go next to the JFK documents. It'll go next to, it'll just be put in a warehouse, and that'll be that. End scene, movie's over.
Absolutely. That's exactly what's happened. I mean, that is exactly the scenario that we now have.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. Let's look forward to 2022, and let's do this. We have a lot of questions in the super chats.
Yeah.
Let's try to move quick so we can answer as many questions, Alexander, as we can. And I'll go into the super chats. I'll go into locals. I'll go into the live stream, and I'll just start pulling out whatever questions you have about 2022. Questions, predictions, comments, and Alexander, I'll just try to just knock them out one by one as best and as quickly as you can. So let's start with the super chats that came in before we started the stream, and then we'll get rolling. All right.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So let me pull those super chats up. All right. Let's begin with Rit. Rit, how are you? Almost every 100 years, a reaction happens in the brain of a Western leader to attack Russia, even though Russia wipes off that Western nation's status as a great power forever. Sweden, France, Germany know well. Alexander.
Well, that's true. The United States has avoided that up to now. We will see whether they will again. There's something very odd about this constant cycle of trying to unite Europe. That's always the first step. You unite all of Europe, you bring all of Europe together, and then you lead a crusade against the Russians, which always ends in disaster. And it seems something like that has been attempted again. I just get the sense that this time there's some people in Washington who are starting to have cold feet about it. There are other people in Washington who, of course, absolutely are pressing relentlessly for this to be pursued to the ultimate point. So we'll see which one it is, and we'll see what happens. But it's important to say that this crusade against Russia has been underway now in this latest cycle of it. And by the way, it's not every 100 years. They happen much more often than that. But anyway, this latest one has been pursued fairly relentlessly, bizarrely, ever since the Cold War ended. And that's what makes it all so strange. So Cold War ends, communism goes, Russia changes completely. They want to be friends with the West. And of course, what instead happens is we have this constant push, which, to be very clear, does not come from Poland or the Baltic states. I mean, they enthusiastic cheerleaders, and they've jumped on this particular bandwagon because, they have their historic grievances against Russia. But it hasn't come from there. It's come from Britain and from the US and from the neocons. And as they've been pushing this, and I think actually what's happened is they've now reached the limit. I think they've now found that if they push further, the kind of disaster that Amrit is talking about will come, or at least more rational people can see that. And as I said, I think this bandwagon, this crusade has now stopped. Or at least I hope so. We'll see.
Okay. From Nuno Lucas says, do you think China alliance with Russia is to be trusted despite the economic advantages for both? I don't know to what extent Russia could trust China because the relationship seems to be one way.
I don't think it is one way. I think, on the contrary, if I have to say, at the moment, I think each of them benefits equally. Now, can I just say this? Of course, lots of people in the United States, in Europe, are particularly suspicious of China at the moment. China is the great challenger. And I think there's a feeling, that because China is this powerful country, very powerful country, which is the challenger of the United States, people don't like to see a situation where Russia is now aligning with China, and that makes them feel that, hopefully there's going to be something which will drive the two apart. My own feeling at the moment is that the Russians are gaining so much more from this relationship that at the moment they will continue with it, and they will continue with it for the foreseeable future. What are they gaining? They're getting a customer for their natural gas, a reliable customer, one who doesn't come along with all kinds of demands and wants to meddle all the time in their domestic politics. They've got a country that is anxious to cooperate with them in science and technology fields. So now we have all these collaborations. Again, a couple of months ago, we got a email at the Duran from somebody who said that, these industrial partnerships are never going to happen. There's never going to be the wide body airliner. There's never going to be the heavy lift helicopter. In fact, it turns out not only will there be, but they're now cooperating on weapons research. So the Russians are getting that too. They're getting investment in their energy industries in the Arctic. They're also getting Chinese interested in developing, working with them on A&I technology. So all of these are just the industrial partnerships which the Russians are getting. The investment, remember, the problem the Russians have always had with their economy is a lack of investment. So they're getting all this investment. And on top of that, and more importantly, at the moment, they're getting leverage over the West. And that is critically important. So if the West comes along and says to the Russians, look, we're going to sanction you if you do A, B, C, the Russians could shrug their shoulders and say, well, we don't have to worry about that too much, because obviously, though your sanctions are going to be problematic for us, we can always find ways around them because we've got huge resources ourselves, and we've got a reliable friend in the East. So the US can tell the Russians, if you do something bad in Ukraine, we will cut off, iPhone sales to Russia. And the Russians can point out, well, iPhones, we like them, but in fact, Chinese smartphones actually outsell they're the major smartphones now circulating in Russia. And the US can then say, well, we'll stop supply of components for even those Chinese smartphones, and the Russians could say, well, that's fine because we're already working with the Chinese on developing subcomponents for those iPhones that are nothing to do with you. The US can say, well, we're going to make it difficult for you to convert rubles into hard currency, so you can't, convert your money into dollars and pounds and euros. And the Russians can say, very well, in that case, we'll trade in other countries with other countries in their currencies, reducing the reserve currency status of the dollar because it will become more marginalized in terms of world trade. So you see the advantages the Russians are getting. It is not one way.
All right. Yes, John, I am into NFT art. Sorry, just a side note there. I saw that in the live stream. Yes, I do like NFT art. Amrit says, apart from Russia's T-14 Armada, Japan and South Korea have made their 4th generation tanks, Type 10 for Japan, and K2 Black Panther. Japan's came before Russia in 2012.
Well, yeah, I think the Armata, which, by the way, the Russians have had, I mean, it's entering service now. I mean, the Russians in 2015 displayed it, and they gave everybody the idea that it was almost ready for service. And of course, it wasn't. It was the ones that they showed on that parade in 2015 were just mock-up vehicles. But the Armata, it's important to understand, it's not just a tank. It's a whole family of vehicles. So the idea is that you build a chassis, and you have an automated turret which you can sort of replace and move around and replace with other types of turrets, and you can switch the engine position. You can do all kinds of things with it, and the result is you can develop, on the basis of the same chassis, an infantry fighting vehicle, an armored personnel carrier, a heavy, a self-propelled gun, all those kinds of things. And you can have large numbers of these different vehicles in the same military unit. And the logistics are simplified because all the parts are interchangeable. So it's a sort of concept of creating a family of vehicles, and it comes with a particular battle concept where instead of a tank battalion operating alongside an infantry battalion, with the infantry battalion providing support for the tanks, now you're going to have a kind of cellular system whereby there'll be tank, all these different vehicles operating within the same unit, all of them sort of wired up and connected to each other, and with robots as well. So it's a new conception of war. It's taken ages to get on top of this and to iron out all the technical problems. And I'm not even saying whether it's even workable or whether it's even a good idea, by the way. It might not be. I'm not an expert in these things, but it's now finally been perfected and it's starting to enter service. And that makes it different from these other vehicles, these other tanks that other countries are now producing, which are much more conventional in terms of their intended operation, even if they are more advanced than other tanks that we've seen. So the Armata, or rather I should say the Armata, it's a Greek word, by the way, is not just a tank. Armata, as Alex will say, it's all about, being armed. That's the whole point about it.
Are Greeks Slavs?
No, emphatically not. We're much, much, much older than Slavs. We are not Slavs. We have, and of course, we were Orthodox long before the Slavs became Orthodox. We are all of us, Greeks, Slavs, Germans, Latins. We're all part of the Indo-European family of languages and nations, which, by the way, includes Iran and to some extent India too. Not all of India. I mean, there's people in the south of India who are not part of that family, but we are not Slavs.
All right. Greeks gave us Slavs our alphabet.
Well, true.
The Cyrillic.
Yeah. The Cyrillic, absolutely.
Which is a nice story.
Absolutely, Cyril and Methodius. It's not just a story; it's a true.
And Methodius.
And Methodius. It's absolutely true. Or Kyrillos και Methodius.
Yeah. The Prince Vladimir, correct?
The Prince, yeah, absolutely, yes. And of course, Prince Vladimir of Rus converted to Orthodoxy when after his dignitaries visited Constantinople and saw the liturgy in the church of Hagia Sophia there.
Yeah. All right, from Toilet Sauce, it's amazing how the EU isn't being involved in European security. Shows who really holds the leash.
Yeah, exactly.
Toilet Sauce.
That's exactly right. And you there was incredibly bitter, angry interview that Josep Borrell, the utterly incompetent, ludicrous, fatuous high representative for foreign policy of the EU had. I mean, you know, he was saying things about the Russians which is just off the scale. I mean, he obviously has a major grievance against the Russians. He had this disastrous visit to Moscow at the start of this year, and he's obviously never got over it. And now he finds that he's not even being invited to the really important talks. And he's furious about it. And he says, you know, Russians can only dictate these types of terms if they're winners. The implication being, of course, that they're losers because they lost the Cold War, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, we can't possibly agree on this, all unacceptable, all those things. And then he must read this morning over his morning cornflakes, if that's what he has for his breakfast, the text, the same text that I was reading from the, you know, the White House briefing before the phone conversation between Biden and Putin. And he must choke because, as I said, none of that language about this is outrageous, unacceptable, we can't possibly talk about these things. None of that is there. And he must feel incredibly angry about it. Remember, Borrell is not elected. He's not accountable to the people of Europe. And like Stoltenberg, who is an analogous position in NATO, he's an ideologue. And what they're seeing is that their ideology is now being threatened. And of course, that's making them very, very angry. And it's making them talk in this ludicrous way. But as you absolutely rightly say, it's the Americans who ultimately pull the strings.
Yeah, bunch of leeches, these guys.
Absolutely.
All these NATO, EU bureaucrats. Yeah. They feed off of the U.S. taxpayer and the EU taxpayer. And he talks tough because he has the U.S. at his back, or at least he thinks he does.
Well, indeed, yeah.
Yeah. If the U.S. pulls out, we'll see how tough Borrell is.
Quite so.
Anyway, Ken Barber says the lowest ebb is the turning of the tide. Happy New Year and God bless to both of you, gentlemen, and to all. Thank you, Ken.
I think that is right. Can I just say something? I mean, you know, we are still in a dark place. I mean, also, let's never forget people are going through an incredibly hard time. I mean, we've had all the lockdowns, closures, all of that. We've had the inflation, the rising prices, which are going to get much worse. We've had all of those things. It's you know, we mustn't forget that. I mean, in terms of how people are living their lives, 2021 has been hard. 2022 could be harder still. But if we look beyond that, things are shifting and maybe in a good direction. I mean, it's quite clear that the project that was launched in the United States has failed. I mean, it's falling apart. We can see it's falling apart. So, I mean, this attempt to transform the United States into something radically different from the United States, it isn't really working. Globalization has, in my opinion, exhausted itself. There was a weird article in the Financial Times. I think it was by Gideon Rachman. Financial Times is, of all the newspapers in Britain, and perhaps in the world, by the way, the one which is most openly and straightforwardly pro-globalization. It's almost moralistic in its devotion to it. One of the things it says, if we start imposing the kind of sanctions on Russia and on China, by the way, that we've been talking about, that is the end of globalization. So already globalization, even they're becoming concerned that, you know, the more they do now, the more that project is falling apart. And anyway, globalization, I think, has hit its limits and is now also starting to retract. And we see the attempt to push the Russians into a box in Europe and to disrupt their society and to destabilize their country. That's run its course. And we see lots of things happening. Now, there's any number of problems unresolved. We still have massive problems in the Middle East. There's the problems in the Pacific, all kinds of things. But I think that, you know, the push has, I mean, even they are starting to sense that this isn't working as they hoped that it would do. And I think the fact that they pulled out all the stops last year to change the administrations, and the administration they finally got has been such a disappointment even for them, that I think that has been a major watershed.
Yeah. Let me just say one quick thing about this. I agree with you, Alexander. I think there's a lot of panic right now amongst the globalist elite. And 2002 may be a worse year than 2021, but we'll wait and see exactly what's going to happen. But the panic is obvious. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples. I think that something went down at Twitter, for example. I think Jack Dorsey, they said, you know what, let's start censoring everybody. Everybody that talks about the coup, everybody that talks about the big O, let's just start, just taking down accounts. And I think Dorsey started to say, you know what, this is just getting too hot for me. I just can't do this. And so they got the new guy, and they are censoring the crap out of everybody. I mean, it's just a bloodbath. I mean, you can't even write the word on Twitter without getting censored. It's crazy. So you have panic there. The Democrats are actually floating Hillary Clinton. That's how bad it's gotten for them. That they're actually thinking about running Hillary Clinton again. I mean, when you think about that, it's crazy.
Yes.
Here in Europe, we're seeing, and I won't get too much into detail, we're seeing big O cases, 30, 40, 50,000 a day. But no one's buying it.
No,
and I'm telling you, no one is buying it. So I mean, you're starting to see the panic set in. They're starting to do these lockdowns. You saw with Boris Johnson, he had to backpedal. And Boris Johnson, he had to backpedal in a big way.
Absolutely.
Because he saw the writing on the wall. The people in the UK pretty much said, no, they did say enough. Boris, if you go down this plan B path, you are out of here. I mean, that's a big deal when he has to, sit there and say, okay, everybody, he probably has to go to his globalist masters and say, look, I can't do this, guys. Bill G, I can't do this. They're going to throw me out of office. I mean, a lot of panic.
Absolutely. Well, for me, I mean, the thing that really, we should be careful what we say, but when the creator of mRNA things gets booted off Twitter, I mean, what is going on? I mean, that is just so bizarre. That was just that's off the scale. I mean, that is panic. I mean, that is blind panic.
Yeah. All right. Toilet Sauce says Ghislaine is guilty. You can all shut up now. You will never see or hear from her again. Now forget all about it and mind your own business while we make sure something fundamentally changes.
So true. Completely right. That's exactly it. I mean, it never happened. It's all over.
Nothing to see here. Move along.
Nothing move his ear. Move on. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Toilet Sauce, for that. Kevin Doley says, Happy New Year, and thanks to all. And thanks for all you have done in 2021. Winter is coming. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that. And Happy New Year to you. Mark Hewitt says, what is the point of the Democrats' recent attack on Elon Musk?
Good question. I'm not sure. Perhaps somebody can explain it to me. I mean, I would say Elon Musk is a extraordinary person. And I've never been able to make sense of him, to be honest. But then, I don't perhaps follow him terribly well. I mean, I don't like. I'll declare an interest. I mean, I'm not a fan of electric cars, at least the way they work. I mean, they don't do anything for me. I mean, I'm one of these people who likes to drive on big continental journeys, and the fact that I can't do that, I mean, anyway, they don't make sense to me. But what exactly it is that has caused them to turn on Elon Musk, I'm not sure. Perhaps Alex, you've got some ideas.
I don't know. Maybe he's not playing ball. I think he's too unpredictable. I think all the oligarchs are all these billionaires. Obviously, they live in a different world, and they move around in different circles than all of us. So I'm sure Elon Musk understands what's going on a very deep level that we just can't comprehend. But maybe he's kind of like that Trump type of figure, or like a Farage type of figure, in that they'll get power, and the Davos crowd, they're saying, okay, let's try this guy out, let's see what he's about, but they can't quite control them. He can move around the circles. And he can, go to the parties, but they don't have complete control over them. And the fact that he's unpredictable probably scares them. Definitely scares them.
I mean, it may not. I don't know how widely it's been reported in the US, but a couple of weeks ago, he was trying to get a meeting with Putin. I remember quite why he wants to meet Putin. I'm not quite sure, but he was. And Putin's spokesman, Peskov, was asked about this, and he said, yeah, well, Putin's willing to meet Elon Musk, but we have to have some idea of why he wants to meet Putin and things of that kind. So, that might have also made some people a bit think to themselves, well, this person is just, not really somebody who's predictable or fully reliable. He also wants to build factories in Russia. That I also know, for his cars, though the industry minister, Manturov, has said that they're not really adapted to the Russian climate, that in winter especially, they're just not very, they just don't work very well because they use up so much power that the batteries quickly run out. So, who knows? But there may be something that was going on there that made some people nervous. But ultimately, I can't really give a simple answer to that question because I don't know. I'll say this: I'm not as interested. I'm not. I don't follow Elon Musk in quite the same attention that I know some other people do. To me, he's just another one of these tech billionaires that floats around. And I mean, he's a bit different in that he's not so much into information as they are, but he's not somebody who, as a person, I'm so interested in, as I'm as interested in as some other people are. So I don't follow his every move, which I think would be very difficult to do anyway, because he comes up with some new idea every 5 minutes or something.
Yeah, well, Elon Musk was part of the PayPal mafia. I mean, he was one of the guys that created PayPal. Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, Peter Thiel, all these guys that created PayPal, and then they all made billions, and they went their separate ways, or they did different things. But these guys, some guys slip through the cracks and they end up being billionaires, and they get through the system somehow.
Yeah,
most of them are allowed to get to where they are. If you look at a Zuckerberg or someone like that, these guys don't make their billions without getting permission from other powers that be. But every once in a while, you may get a guy like Musk who kind of slips through the system, the way that Trump kind of slipped through the system and became president. But we'll find out. I think
we'll find out about it. We will.
You got to remember, Bill Gates 15 years ago, 20 years ago, no one was thinking about Bill Gates in the same way they're thinking about him now. I mean, he was a monopolist with Microsoft. He did some bad things when he was running Microsoft, but no one could have ever imagined.
No, so true.
He would be what he is today.
Absolutely.
So, time will tell.
We'll explain.
Yeah. Maria says, "Good day, ANA. I have no good feeling about the. Oh wait, no, I have no good feeling about the Russia-China alliance. Think that Russia will lose on it. Time will show what."
I know a lot of people say that. As I said, I at the moment, my own feeling is the Russians are gaining from it. And look at it from their point of view. What options do they have? I mean, in the 90s and the early 2000s, including when Putin was there, they wanted friendship with the West. But the West, far from wanting friendship with them, was constantly putting pressure on them. It was trying to detach from, their system, other Soviet republics, pull them into NATO. It was pushing military forces ever closer to Russia's borders. It was interfering in their domestic policies. It was making it incredibly difficult for the Russians to develop their own economy in all kinds of different ways. And I can remember, this is before Ukrainian crisis happened. For example, when the Russians tried to buy Opel after General Motors went bust in the 2008-2009 crisis. And the US embassy, this is, at a time when things were not as bad between Russia and the West as they are today. And even then, the US blocked it. The US embassy in Berlin actively campaigned against it, and they blocked it. So given that is so, you have a situation where China comes along. As I said, it offers you all the trade deals. It doesn't come with any political strings. It offers investment. It offers all sorts of things. It also gives you a sense, that you get more leverage over the West. So from a Russian point of view, it makes sense. Why look, as we say in Britain, a gift horse in the mouth. Now, what can happen in 10, 20 years? Well, that's, for the future. But look at it from the Russian perspective today, and it makes perfect sense. Of course, if the West had run its foreign policy in a completely different way and had done things, 20 years ago, 30 years ago even, differently with respect to Russia, we would not be in the place we are now. Russia at that point would probably have definitely preferred to integrate with the West, to become part of the Western institutions. I mean, that was very much what Putin, in fact, wanted, as I very well remember. He was talking about, our common European home. That was Gorbachev's slogan, and Putin was, to some extent, reviving all of that. But the West turned Russia away. So logically, it's turned to China. And of course, China was always there telling the Russians, don't trust the Europeans, don't trust the Americans. They're not really your friends. We are prepared to work with you. Our economies are complementary. Our trade policies are complementary. We need your technology and your natural resources. You need our investment and our industrial skills. Let's team up. And of course, eventually, the Russians said yes.
All right. From Kurt, I predict that Putin and Biden will meet in Geneva on January 10th, and Sputnik agrees. Happy New Year to all. I
completely agree. I don't know whether it's going to be on January the 10th, possibly not as fast as that. But my own personal view is that this telephone call that's happening today is all preparations for the next summit meeting.
All right. Thank you, Kurt, for that. And Flying Boar says Maxwell trial is a preview of what will happen to Julian Assange.
Yes. If he goes to the US. We did a big program about this with Robert Barnes. And I have to say that I'm very conflicted about this. I mean, there is Julian Assange caught in a spider's web in Britain. There's one last chance that the Supreme Court, the British Supreme Court, will look at this High Court decision, which, to be clear, is just absurd, and throw it out and uphold the original judge's decision and refuse the extradition. And the US has then said it will begin extradition proceedings all over again. But even the High Court, in that recent judgment, that's appalling judgment, accepted that would probably be an abusive process. If that happens, then obviously it would be good for Assange. But if not, then he's going to be caught indefinitely in this huge legal battle in Britain, re-arguing many of the same points in a new appeal against the High Court to the High Court against the previous judgments. I mean, it's going to go on forever. And I've been saying to myself, well, maybe he's better going to the US and putting his defense there. Maybe Americans will understand First Amendment defenses. I know that's not his own wish, by the way. I mean, I've been told this clearly by people who are in contact with him. He is still very nervous of going to the US. He still thinks that will be a bad thing for him. And then you look at the Ghislaine trial and you say, well, is that really a jurisdiction where Assange can win? If they do that to Ghislaine, I mean, they're going to do the same to Assange. I mean, it does make one despair. It does make one wonder what are the good options for him. And if they can do that, if we're going to get into a situation where courts are used in this kind of way against people like Ghislaine, against people like Assange, against Michael Flynn before. Remember how Michael Flynn was caught in a kind of legal web through the actions of a judge, which, I mean, I still find that unbelievable. But, if all of these things can happen, well, one asks oneself, what's happening to the judiciary? What is happening to the rule of law? We are in a very, very dangerous and difficult place indeed.
All right. Kurt says, my prediction for 2022 is that the Kuf narrative will be impossible to sustain, so something different and possibly worse will be attempted.
Well, on the first point, you are absolutely right.
The second
I can
point,
say I could say that in Britain already. I mean, when I go to my stores, the stores around London, I've noticed that everybody's taken their masks off, for example, despite the fact that the thing is supposed to be circling around in ever vaster numbers. So I mean, people have just stopped believing, or maybe not believing. I mean, they've just had enough of it. That's absolutely clear. As to the second part of what you say, you may very well be right. I'm not going to try and speculate what it is, but of course, the more they do this sort of thing, the more cynical people become.
Yeah. DJC says, who do we suppose is in charge of the response to the Russians in Washington?
Very good question. I don't
Who
know.
is in charge?
Who is in charge? Who is making the decisions? I'm going to make one observation. I don't want to make make too much of this, but it's been interesting that Milley, who is, by the way, a very political general, the chairman of the Combined Chiefs of Staff, is now talking to Gerasimov, who's his equivalent in Russia, the chief of staff there of the Russian military. That they're speaking to each other on the phone almost continuously. There's a kind of parallel line of negotiations underway, and I do wonder whether perhaps some of the people in the Pentagon, some of the uniformed military in the Pentagon, aren't saying to themselves, well, look, we've got this huge challenge in the East against China. We can't afford to be bogged down in Ukraine, where we don't really have good military options. And, let's try and find some kind of arrangement which will just hold things together. And it's been interesting that the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov he's actually been giving several interviews, but he gave a massive one recently in which he disclosed the fact that there will be military officers, senior military officers, in the negotiating teams of each side. So I wonder whether perhaps some of the decisions, some of the more voices of reason, aren't coming from the uniformed military in the Pentagon. That's only a guess. I don't know that's true. And, I'm not saying that, all the people in the military in Washington are, realists, far from it. I just don't know. But, that seems to me as good a guess as any. I also get the sense, by the way, however, that the State Department is also being marginalized. I mean, it's interesting that when Victoria Nuland came to Moscow and it was a total fiasco, somebody in Washington decided to send the CIA director, William Burns, basically in her place, as far as I can see, to pick up all the pieces after the damage she'd done. And maybe that, there's an attempt to sort of cut the State Department out of the picture too. I don't know. I can only speculate to some extent who it is. Clearly, it's not the president, because I don't think he's up to that kind of thing himself. Somebody is strategizing. Who it is, very difficult to say. And of course, in Washington, for every person who has a realist view, you have about 10 who don't. And, the battle is going to be incredibly hard within the Washington bureaucracy as well.
Okay, Missoni says, are there any groupings or champions in the UK government of civil service who advocate for an independent UK foreign policy? And Byron Nakis says, how much do you think Brexit is being squandered and what needs to be done to save it?
You're both excellent questions, and both of them, to my mind, are, in a sense, you could answer them both together. Answer: within the civil service, I haven't seen a single person. The Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, is populated by neoliberals, neocons, people who are fervid Remainers. They do not want to pursue any kind of independent foreign policy. I get the sense the same is true of the political class. When people like Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn, from very different perspectives, came up through the system and wanted to suggest possible alternatives. I'm not saying, I know a lot of people have strong feelings about Corbyn, but he did present a kind of alternative. The entire political class, including the permanent government, united against him, just as they are united against Farage, arguably, in fact, unquestionably, in my opinion, a far more formidable politician. I don't see anybody in the political class who is able to enunciate or articulate an alternative foreign policy at all. And the consequence is exactly as you say, the opportunities for Brexit are being squandered. There is a push to take us closer to Europe again, a push to try to militarize our global foreign policy instead of focusing on making it truly independent by pursuing independent trade, commercial and business policies. So the result is that the chances that were there are being lost, and the same is true of our domestic policies too, where we see now that the Johnson government has been pursuing a kind of social democratic economic policy, very similar to that of the Labour Party. So we are losing the opportunities that existed. We're squandering them because the political class viscerally doesn't want to go there. It still thinks Brexit was a disaster. It still regrets Brexit. It doesn't like any part of the kind of policies that would make sense if you do Brexit well.
All right. Leafy Bug says, I marvel at the remnants of diabolical genius the people behind the scenes still draw upon, imposing the trial outcomes they desire. They're so brazen that they only bump the judge up to the circuit court mid-trial. And one of the leading prosecutors is the daughter of Comey. It's like they aren't trying to hide the conspiracy. What they want is for conspiracy theorists to point out the obvious and seize upon their claims, discredit any notion that things aren't above board. Yeah, they are the people doing the conspiracies, and they call everyone else a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. You put it beautifully. You put it exactly right. But look at the outcome. It's there for all to see. By the way, I should say something. I mean, I felt the same way when I read that High Court judgment after a few weeks ago in the Assange case. I mean, I was reading it through. And by the way, it is also unbelievably short. For a case of that kind, 27 pages is nothing. I mean, I was expecting something like, 100, 150 pages of densely argued material, and I was expecting it to come around late January, early February, because I was thinking that the judges would make an effort to think this thing through, and I was just astonished. I couldn't believe it, and I had exactly the same feeling as you've had, that this just can't be true. It simply isn't a kind of legal process that makes any kind of sense to me.
Yeah. Kelly75 says, the one thing that is clear to me is that the current crisis with Russia is immeasurably more dangerous as a result of the political and propaganda environment in the U.S. created by Mueller, Russiagate, and the first Trump impeachment. How can current officials, even if they know Russia isn't bluffing, explain any concessions they negotiate? Where is the non-humiliating off-ramp for these officials? How can these officials possibly level with the U.S. public now, even in a crisis?
You are so right on everything you've just said. You are so exactly right. And that is going to be a massive problem. I mean, even if you are a realist, even if you understand, let's assume it's the US military. I mean, there's some people, especially as far as I can see in Strategic Command, the US Strategic Command, who have a greater grasp of these things. I'm not talking about Milley so much, but some of the people who are in charge of the US nuclear defense forces. They come across to me as highly intelligent people with a real grasp of the dangers. How did they come round now, after all that's been said about Putin, after all that's been said about after Russiagate? How did they come round and explain the kind of policy, a kind of deal, which was so universally condemned when it was floated by Donald Trump? Now, it was, by the way, before he became president, after the 2016 election, I can remember there was talk about a grand bargain between Russia and the US, very much the kind of deal you could sense Trump was working towards. He hadn't thought out the details, because he never does. And he's the sort of person who, anyway, develops his ideas, I think, as over the course of a negotiation, as many people in business do. But the outlines, I remember it all came out in an interview he gave with the Times, the London Times, were not that different from what we're seeing being talked about now. And everybody said this proves that he's really an agent of the Kremlin. So that was the deal that, triggered all that hysteria at the time. How do you justify a deal like that, if that's the deal you're going to make? A deal which, by the way, is in US interest. And if you really want to pull Russia away from China, that's the kind of deal you should be looking at. How do you justify? Explain it now to the American people. How do you get past all the things you've said before? It's going to be all but impossible. And get a deal like that, a treaty like that through the Senate, where you can forget it. I mean, obviously the Ted Cruz's, Lindsey Graham's, all those people will oppose it, but most of the Democrats will oppose it too. They will find it impossible to justify it to the people who follow Rachel Maddow and who've been reading the New York Times and CNN and all those things, who had their minds pumped up with all that sort of thing. That there's a limit to how much you can do. And that's going to be a huge problem. And it's going to haunt us for years. It's one of the major disastrous legacies of Russiagate.
Rocky Lux that says there are Russian news articles saying that Kosovo and Albania are in talks regarding unification. How realistic is unification, and what will happen to the Serbian north of Kosovo?
Well, there are talks. I mean, I don't think that there are talks. I'm sure there are discussions, and it is a real possibility. The Russians are, of course, fiercely opposed. Serbia is fiercely opposed. What Serbia would do in that case, I don't know. But, of course, in that kind of situation, with Serbia obviously committed to protecting people in Kosovo, Serbian people in Kosovo. Again, Vucic isn't looking for a fight. But if he simply abandons the people in Kosovo, then he will face a massive political crisis in Serbia as well. So he will have to stand up and oppose this and have to take action to protect the people, the Serbian people in Kosovo. And of course, in that kind of situation, again, we are looking at a very real possibility of renewed fighting in the Balkans.
Yeah. Davwell says, not interested in Tesla, but enjoyed watching the SpaceX clean Boeing's clock. Poor Boeing still on the pad. Yes, they are. Onassis says, is the end of the EU nigh?
Well, I don't know. We always say this. I mean, there have been times when I've said to myself, well, it can't go on much longer. I think it's so ludicrously dysfunctional that it's impossible that it could keep going for much longer. And they always manage somehow to stagger on till the next crisis. I think we are perhaps at an important inflection point, because we now have a new government in Germany with, of course, the Greens prominent in it. They are completely, fervently pro-EU. And I think that the Social Democrats, they're not perhaps quite as fervently pro-EU as the Greens are, but they're receptive to some of the things the Greens are saying. And we have another financial crisis. I think this government, this German government, is much more likely to do those things which Angela Merkel always, in the end, refused to do, which is to go for Eurobonds. In other words, to pool debt sharing across Europe so that, Italy, Germany, all of them, they become part of a single monetary system.
Netherlands is going to throw a fit. Finland's going to throw a fit. I mean,
so will the German public.
So will the German public.
So will the German public. And at that point, when that happens, there will be a crisis in Germany. Quite possibly the coalition will fail, collapse. And at that point, of course, that could be the inflection. That could be the breaking point, because I think the reaction against that is going to be so strong that I just can't see how it can be pulled off without, triggering a gigantic crisis within Germany itself. But that's I think where this is heading to. And of course, if we have a revolt against the EU, against this kind of policy at the EU core, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, those sort of places, then it's over. Game over, frankly.
Yeah. Digar says, Obama placed too many judges and Soros backed too many DAs. They made a mess.
Yeah, so true.
Soros.
Completely. But the legacy has been a deeply politicized judicial landscape in the United States to an extent that I have never known.
Yeah. That's Soros. He gets around.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see.
I mean, of course, we're talking about not just one individual. We're talking about a whole group of things. But again, there's something almost deranged about this. I mean, it has a sort of a fanatical quality that is
a demonic
quality, but it isn't even clever anymore. I mean, it's so overdone in some ways. I mean, instead of doing something gradually and incrementally, the story that if you have the frog in the water, you have to heat up the water slowly in order to boil the frog, because otherwise, if you do it too fast, it will just jump out. Well, it seems to me they're boiling the water. They've been trying to boil the water too fast.
Yeah. Alan says they are trying so hard to get the UK back in. The electorate senses this political social conflict is in the air.
I agree. I completely agree with you. I think this is entirely correct. I think this is coming. I think, obviously, I mean, this is one of the problems. So much ultimately depends on one man at the moment in Britain, who is Farage. But remember, with each iteration of this, the distance between the British electorate and its political class grows. And you could see this. The amount of cynicism in Britain today is at a level I have never known in all my lifetime. And, I've followed British politics well since the 70s.
Yeah, I agree with that. I definitely agree with that. Dita Pong says, China, Russia, architecting a new structure for economic, financial, and military collaboration across the world.
This is, by the way, we're going back to the question of the Chinese-Russian alliance. This is the great danger for the US. And if you really want to pry Russia away from China, you've got to do it very fast. Because, of course, if they create these financial structures, these joint financial structures, which they are now doing, I mean, these are now works in progress. Siberia 2 is now under construction. Merging of the two financial systems, it's all underway. They're involved now in joint industrial planning. They're developing military technologies together. Give it another 2 or 3 years, you're past the point of no return. And I think that's I think the point people have got to understand. The window, if you're going to try and create distance between the two, is now very short. In 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, it won't be possible any longer, because the two states, the two structures, the political and economic structures of these two countries will have in effect become one.
I think it's even over now. I mean,
I
understand what you're saying. 2-3 years. I think it's over now. I think there's no way that Russia can integrate with Europe or the US at this point in time.
I agree.
It's over.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. And can I just say something else? There are still a few Russians. I read an article by a man called Alexander Gabuyev in the Financial Times a few days ago. Still a few Russians who, of a liberal perspective, who regret this. There was another one by a man called Valery Grossman, who was writing for Echo Moskvy, which is a sort of liberal radio channel. But if you meet ordinary Russians, most Russians, and you communicate with them, as I do to some extent, and even many, many elite Russians now, they say, so be it. This is better for us.
Well,
than
all the
what the
elite
West
Russians
has
have been sanctioned. I mean, like
done.
literally
Exactly.
all
Well,
of them,
exactly.
all the
Well,
oligarchs,
exactly.
they're all
Well,
sanctioned. So, I
exactly.
mean,
Well,
you know,
exactly. So, I mean, they say to you, well, what alternative do we have?
yeah.
So let's make the best of it. I mean, maybe we will be part of Greater Eurasia, which will be China will be the dominant pole. We understand that. We realize that. But we will still have far more scope and freedom to work within this system than with what the Americans and the Europeans have been offering us. At least the Chinese understand that we have our own concerns and that we are anyway by ourselves a significant power. So they treat us with an understanding that the Europeans and the Americans don't. There is no equivalent to Jens Stoltenberg or Josep Borrell in Beijing. You won't find people like that there. And that makes all the difference.
Yeah. Biden called Putin a killer. Borrell called the Russians losers. I mean, it's over.
Yes,
It is over. The best that they can hope for, the United States at this point in time is the policy that Trump laid out, which I think Trump was seeing things in a much more realpolitik, practical level.
Yeah, I agree.
We just need to find ways to create an international structure where we get along. That's what Trump was. America first, and let us find ways to get along with the Russians and find ways to trade with the Chinese.
Agreed. I agree with that.
In a fair way. That was Trump's vision of things. And
I agree.
That's the only way. You're not going to absorb or get Russia on side at this point.
No. And by the way, that would be if you're talking about the United States as opposed to this monstrosity, which is now being called the collective West, I'm not sure. I think that is the optimal outcome. I'm very much someone who believes America first is the best policy.
We're both in. I mean,
the United States.
You're in the UK. I'm in Europe, and I'll say this outright. I think it's in the US's best interest to not deal with the EU.
Absolutely.
I mean, the EU is like a weight on the US.
Absolutely.
And I would like to, being in Europe, to obviously have the UK at our back, the US at our back. But for the US and the American people, the EU is just like it is literally a leech.
Absolutely. I mean, just listen to the kind of people you have in Europe. Just see them in operation. Do you really want to be involved with people like that?
Yeah.
And I mean, economically, just think about it. They haven't even created a single tech company. I mean, it's just, this is supposed to be, the other great pole of economic power in the West. They haven't even managed to create one. There is no European Google. There is no European Amazon. There's nothing.
Yeah. All right. Valies is in the house, and thank you for the super chat, Valies. Also, Cosmic Rain is in the house, as is Reckless Abandon.
Yeah.
All right. Great. A lot of good moderators now helping us out. And let's get to some more questions, Alexander, from Jay Galt. My friend insists the smart grid Great Reset is being tested in China and their Davos controlled, now being chosen to advance globalism. Thoughts?
I don't think so, actually. I think that the Chinese have their own vision of things, and I don't think that they are Davos controlled. I would add that I have massive issues with the Chinese vision of things. But if I have to be straightforward about it, I think the influence, if anything, has been in the opposite direction. I think some people in the West, in Davos, looked at some of the things the Chinese have done. And, it's a very controlled society in China. And they say, oh, this is all very nice. Let's try and introduce it in the West and try and do it here because, we can have all these social credit schemes and surveillance systems that the Chinese do. And we can import it to the United States and to Europe, and it will help us to control things, and we can all do this as part of some great globalization experiment. And this is, I think, very much, in other words, the influence, the ideas, have anything flowed in the opposite direction. But I think the Chinese, which is remember, it's a civilizational state. It's a very difficult state in some ways to understand. Well, I think what the Chinese have done is they've looked at all these globalization trends in the West and they've surfed them in their own interests, and they've done it very well. And I think in the end, they played them. And I think that one of the reasons you see in the West this sudden massive shock about China is that I think people have suddenly understood that the Chinese were playing us all along. And I think that was, Trump understood it. He's much faster on the uptake than some people. He's not an intellectual. He's not somebody, who reads things and works it out that way. He has a sort of instinctive flair for grasping these kind of things, a sort of sense.
Street smart.
Street smart, exactly. He grasped it very fast. And I think what he got in 2015, 2016, it's interesting to see how the clever people have only now finally started to understand it.
Yeah. Valias says, Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you, Valias, for that. And Toilet Sauce with the big super chat says, the fact that the Greens are de facto in charge of the German government proves to me again that elections don't matter in Western democracy. The powers that be have their people in every party and put them in positions that suits them.
I agree with that, but I think that if you look at the situation with the Greens, it's particularly weird. This is a party that didn't even do particularly well in the German elections. I mean, they were expected to come first. They didn't. They didn't come close to coming first in the German elections. Baerbock, I mean, the German electorate looked at her. They didn't like her. I mean, support for her over the course of the election crashed. I can never remember the name of her other co-leader of the Greens, but they didn't like much. They didn't like the look of him very much either. Obviously, they have a core of support, around 20%, but even that core Green support in Germany, much of it is very different from what the leadership of the Greens themselves are. So, I mean, most Greens, for example, most people who vote Green in Germany support Nord Stream 2. Just to give one example. And yet, these unsuccessful leaders, one of them gets the foreign ministry, the other gets the economics ministry, one of the most powerful in Germany. I mean, and how is it possible that a party that has done so poorly is so successful in basically capturing the German government? It is very bizarre. It's very, very weird. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. But about, the fact that elections increasingly don't matter. And this is, as I said, an extreme example of this, where the loser has ended up running everything. But I do wonder how sustainable in the long term it is.
Yeah. Dan says, what are your thoughts on Basel III implementation, the possibility of some kind of return to a gold-backed currency by China and Russia?
Well, I think Basel III and what the Russians, Chinese do are quite separate things. I mean, the whole Basel changes were very much part of the globalization process. What the Russians and the Chinese will do is different. Now, I should say, I still think that they will initially be, I don't think they're going to go for a gold-backed currency, despite the fact that certainly the Russians, and probably to an even greater extent, the Chinese have been hoarding gold. But then, of course, we don't really know about how much gold the Chinese really have. Most people believe that they're greatly understating the size of their gold reserves. But I do think that they're heading towards a separate financial architecture. I think initially it will not be backed by gold. In fact, I don't really see how it can be backed by gold. But of course, if they create that financial architecture backed by their foreign currency and gold reserves and by the massive reserves that exist in China, in Chinese banks, because Chinese people are still heavy savers, I don't think they need it to be backed by gold for it to be attractive. The The big question is, how will this operate? Will it be a single currency system? I doubt it, actually. Or will they do something more like what J.M. Keynes suggested back in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, where you have all sorts of independent currencies, but you have a single unit of exchange which is used in order to try and you trade in that. So you trade in this notional unit of exchange, but things are immediately converted into your national currencies. Maybe it will be something like that.
All right.
I think he called it the BORMAC, but I can't be. I'm not absolutely sure.
Okay, Singular is a new member to the Duran community. Welcome, Singular. And Filipina Traveler TV says, my hope for 2022 is that people will realize that nothing gives a politician more fear than the courage of people. Happy New Year, Alex.
So very, very true. And again, going back to a program that we did with Robert Barnes, I mean, one has to, again, this is the fundamental difference with the US and Europe. There've been a whole string of cases in the US. I'm not going to discuss over which topic. I'm sure many of you can guess, but I don't want to, because of course there's so many concerns about this from our platforms. But there was a whole string of cases brought by, just people, nobody vastly important in the United States. They took on the US government, they took on big corporations, and they won. And in America, you can do that. Try doing that in Europe and see what happens to you. Try doing that in Britain and see what happens to you. Far more different. That's why I say the US is different from Europe in these kind of things. And the less the Americans have to do with Europe, the better off they are.
All right. Irish Partisan says, Happy New Year, guys. Here's to a very eventful and interesting 2022. Thank you very much for that, Irish Partisan. And Kurt Fromm says, on New Year's Eve, go out, sing as if no one is listening, love as you have never been hurt, and dance as if no one is watching. Happy New Year's to all.
We will do all those things.
Excellent, Kurt. Thank you for that. Susie sends
Except
a super
dance.
chat.
I'm a terrible dancer, by the way, and my singing voice is more like a croak. But nonetheless, I will do all the other things.
You can still have a good time. Rich says, Susie sends a super chat. Thank you very much, Susie. Rich says, out of nearly 500 different critical component suppliers to Apple, nearly 250 are Chinese, 140 are Japanese, 20 South Korean, some 40 in other Asian nations.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah, but it's entirely right. So you're going to try and stop Apple sales in Russia when, as I said, you think that Apple is purely an American business. Think what the effect of that will be in China, by the way. I mean, they will say, you've got this company, makes its products with us, they use all our components, and now they're trying to impose sanctions on the country which is our biggest friend to prevent this product, which is largely made in our own country, being sold there. What are the Chinese going to think about that? Are they perhaps going to start saying to themselves, well, maybe we ought to be looking at restricting the kind of subcomponents that Apple gets? What does that do for Apple? Again, I wonder whether all this has been properly worked through.
And Huawei is building all kinds of components now too, as well.
Absolutely,
so they're getting into this.
Of course they can. Of course they can, and they're working with Russia, and they recently disclosed the fact that their 3G networks, which is a while back, were designed with the help of a Russian engineer. So and they're now working with Russian universities. Now, I mean, I'm not the one who want to overestimate. I'm sure the Russian input relative to what Huawei is doing is very small. But, that's the kind of game that we're seeing. So you're going to drive Apple out of the Russian market, strengthen Huawei, set up again a new, entirely distinct, separate AI 5G system in rivalry to your own, when your own isn't even really up and running yet.
Juha sends us a super sticker. Thank you very much, Juha, for that. And Violin Merchant says, Steven Seagal has a more productive dialogue with Moscow than the State Department. What a time to be alive. Happy New Year's, guys.
Well,
I think he got a passport, actually, didn't he?
Absolutely. I think he did. But can I just say something? I mean, you put your finger on an incredibly important point, because the State Department, I mean, sucks. It's the worst foreign ministry in the world by far. And I say that, I mean, the European ones are pretty awful too. But somehow or other, I think this started with Dick Cheney, but I mean, Obama took it to even further levels. It's become absolutely populated with neocons and neoliberals and people of this kind, ideologues. And of course, they can't do their job as a result.
Yeah. The man says, Alexander, do you believe that Germany ever gave up the idea of controlling and dominating Europe? Happy New Year. By the way, you guys are doing an excellent job. Well done.
That's a very interesting and very good question, because I think the answer actually is no. But of course, the Germans will tell you, and I think they will believe this, that on the contrary, they absolutely have. And that in place of the idea that used to exist in Germany, they want, instead of a German Europe, they want a European Germany, as they like to put it. Except, of course, when you discuss with them what they mean by a European Germany, what they actually end up saying is, of course, it's a German Europe. The two end up being one and the same thing. I think things are getting a bit out of control because, of course, if Baerbock and the Greens have their way, then, as I said, you will eventually get a situation where instead of dominating and controlling Europe, which is what the Germans have achieved, we will get a situation where the European bureaucrats in Brussels end up controlling Germany because, as I said, they have debt mutualization and all those sort of things. And I think at that point, when the Germans find themselves in that situation, where instead of running the whole thing, they find that the thing that they've spawned is running them, they won't like it at all. And then there will be a massive pushback. But I think most Germans, when they talk about a European Germany, they assume a German Europe. and I think that that's still very much the mindset and the belief many Germans have, that that's the best way, both for Germany and Europe too. I think many Germans, and I've had discussions with Germans about this, find it very difficult to understand or conceptualize that what they're actually saying is bad for Germany and it's bad for Europe as well.
Yeah. Alan Watson says, if Trump had not lost, the UK and US would be much closer and better off. And Digar says, American first candidate will get backing. It's pretty clear that this current admin doesn't give a crap about America or foreign policy. I still have hopes for 2024, and maybe there can be a turn in both domestic and foreign.
Yeah, I think the first part of is absolutely right. I mean, I think the point about Johnson is that his administration really began to unravel last year when Trump lost the election, because I mean the entire premise upon which the Johnson administration was constructed was upon Trump remaining president. And I mean, I think that was the idea of it. But having said that, in a way, that's also testament to a fundamental failure, because you should never put all your cards on, put all your chips on one number, if you like. I mean, that's not the right way to do it. And if you have that kind of mindset, then you lose sight of your many other options. I mean, changing the metaphor, Bismarck once said, you play your game on every square of the chessboard. And so the Johnson government depended and relied on Trump. If Trump had been elected, it would have paid off. When Trump was not elected, they haven't known what to do, and we see this drift instead. So we shouldn't acquit the British, or at least Johnson and his team, of the mistake. But obviously, it has been a massive blow to them, the fact that Trump wasn't elected. Now, the second point, I think it's highly likely we will see a Republican in the presidency in 2024. I think it's possible it could be Donald Trump. I don't think it's a certainty. And I think it's far from a certainty that if it's another Republican, it will be an America First Republican. We will, because of course, we must never forget that within the Republican Party, there is also a battle underway. Now, having said that, I saw a recent opinion poll in the United States which showed that Mitch McConnell, who is, of course, the de facto leader of the establishment wing of the Republican Party, is now incredibly unpopular with the American electorate, including, by the way, with most Republicans. So we'll see how it works out.
Flying Boar says, update on Syria and why the neocons are after Ethiopia and Somalia.
It's a very good question. I mean, two completely different questions, two completely different conflicts, I should say. I get the sense that with Syria, there's a kind of stabilization. I mean, there was a last attempt to try to undermine the Syrian government with the Caesar sanctions and all of that. And that did provoke an economic crisis. What I've heard is that the economic situation in Syria has stabilized. I mean, they obviously have had quite a lot of help from the Russians. They probably had help from other people. But, you know, the plunge in the Syrian economy that followed, that seems to have abated. And we are increasingly seeing other Arab states beginning to start to reopen their embassies in Damascus. The UAE sent its foreign minister to meet Assad. And the talk is that behind the scenes, the Russians are working with the Saudis to get the Saudis to reopen their embassy in Syria also, and to readmit Syria into the Arab League. When that happens, by the way, in my opinion, it becomes game over for the US military presence in Syria, because at that point, the Arabs will say that there will be a position that, you know, the Americans are occupying Arab land. And I think you'll start to see the pressure for them to leave. So that's the diplomatic front. Now, there is the military side of things. And Idlib province is where the major conflict is. And incrementally, inch by inch, you see the Syrians gradually, with the Russian backing, gaining more and more control. As I understand it, the jihadis are now essentially restricted within Idlib province to two areas. One is Idlib city, the other is a region along the Turkish border. And they're protected there because the Turkish military is there. But as we all know, the situation in Turkey is now becoming increasingly grave. The Turkish electorate, the Turkish public, has turned strongly against this intervention in Syria. The talk is that eventually there might be some deal done. Those Turkish troops will withdraw, and it could very well be that we will see a diplomatic solution, and it could happen next year. I think it's highly likely that Idlib will be fully under Syrian government control in 2022. That's what I think. The other complicated issue is with the Kurds in northeast Syria. And when Trump was pulling his troops out, it looked like he was going to pull US troops out of Syria, there was a brief period when the Kurds were talking with the Syrian government. And when that was reversed, the Kurds stopped. I mean, they are very manipulative about these things. And frankly, they anger the Russians a lot over that. The Russians have been telling the Kurds are sending delegations to Moscow all the time. They said, you know, you're stupid. The Americans aren't going to be there for very long. If there is this reconciliation between Syria and the other Arab states, the Americans will have to leave. And at that point, you have no option but to do a deal with the Syrian government. And at that point also, if the Americans leave first, before you've done that deal, the deal you'll have done will be worse for you than the deal you would be doing if you left now. So again, it depends, I think, on the diplomacy. If there is this deal done, if Syria is readmitted into the Arab League, I think you will see the whole of Syria under Syrian government control, probably over the course of 2022. If this deal isn't done next year, it will take a bit longer.
Yeah. Ethiopia, Somalia?
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry about that. Well, that is a very good question. Why? I can't speak for Somalia. I've lost track of the situation there. But Ethiopia, why the US decided to try and destabilize and overthrow, in effect, the government in Ethiopia, I have absolutely no idea. But they did. As I said, somebody released a recording of US officials talking to the Tigrayan Liberation Front, which quite obvious that the US is backing the Tigrayans against Ethiopia and was looking forward to the day when the Tigrayans would take Addis Ababa. And I've been told by somebody who is in a position to know, somebody who's connected to veterans, intelligence professionals for SANT. He's not a member, but he works with some of the people who are there. In other words, VIPs, in other words, former US intelligence officers. He was told that the recording was made by Chinese intelligence, and it was they who gave it to the Ethiopian government, and that was then used by the Ethiopian government to rally support across, the world. Anyway, the result is, of course, that this Ethiopian counteroffensive, backed by Turkey and the UAE and China, has been extremely successful. And why did the US do this? Why did the US want to intervene in Ethiopia? Well, I think the short answer is that they were worried that Ethiopia, the new Ethiopian government, Prime Minister Abiy's government, was becoming altogether too friendly to China. And it had done a deal with Eritrea, the government in Eritrea, which is a strong ally of China. And I think, again, you had all the geopolitics, all the people playing the chess in East Africa, and it's turned out incredibly badly. So I think that was the underlying story there, and it's failed. Or at least it looks like it's going to fail.
All right. Kurt Fromm says, Alex Jones said that Elon Musk considered a political career, maybe even the top position. His source was someone who knows Elon well. Elon for president.
That wouldn't surprise me. I mean, it'd be an interesting development.
Yeah, why not? Hey Man says, join the Duran community and says, laws are silent in times of war and emergency power.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, that's a point to make about war. Everybody has been making all kinds, all these rules and laws and, war crimes laws and things like that have been developed over the years to try and sort of give a kind of legal structure to law. The reality is, as wars progress, all those legal structures eventually break down, because, of course, war is the antithesis of peace. And as the antithesis of peace, it is by definition the system of chaos and a system where there is no law. I mean, when people are killing each other, talking about law in that kind of situation makes absolutely no sense. So you cannot have ultimately war and law at the same time. I mean, it's impossible. And that's absolutely true. What you say is absolutely right. And of course, states of emergency are much the same. If they are prolonged indefinitely, they also ultimately cause legal structures, due process, all of those things to break down. That is why you should always prefer peace. Now, coming back to I think the question behind your question, I think there are some people who understand this very well. And of course, they don't want to have a system where there is proper law. They don't want to have proper due process. So that's why they like wars. And that's why they like states of emergency. Because, of course, operation of law breaks down in that kind of situation, and you can replace it with rules, orders, and all those sort of things. The problem is, look, wartime situations and state of emergency type situations are structurally unstable. They are chaotic, and you can't ultimately control them as perhaps you think you can. And so you may think having those kind of states serves your purposes, but in the end, probably they don't.
Yeah. Leafy Bug says Musk is ineligible for the position of POTUS as he was born in South Africa. Well, he can be governor, I guess.
Presumably so, yeah.
He can be
I didn't know. Yeah.
That's true. Dan Noyes says electric cars are a means of control. Germany is shutting down 4 nuclear plants. When electric cars are mandated, the power grid must expand 300%. Plus, China has monopoly on battery production.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's perfect that you make this point because, of course, so much of this is completely illogical. I mean, it's been made, the same point has been made about Britain. If we move towards electric cars, to have only electric cars, which is, I mean, it has all kinds of, it's problematic in itself, in my opinion. But if you move towards that, the demands on the electric grid are going to multiply by orders of magnitude. And you need, in that case, to enhance the electric grid. And there's no sign that anything like that is being done. And of course, in Germany, they're doing the opposite. They're going in the opposite direction. They're cutting down their nuclear power stations and doing it, by the way, in the midst of an energy crisis. I mean, it's very difficult sometimes to see the logic to all of this. I mean, the method, if you like, in the madness. There's that wonderful scene in Apocalypse Now where, somebody says, I think it's, Kurt says, can you see the method in my madness? And the other person says, well, I can't really see the method at all. I can't see that there's any method at all. I can't see the method in this. I mean, none of this adds up.
Wealth transfer.
There
you go. Money. Kuplik says, what happened to the U.S.-Taiwan tensions? It was all over the news a few months ago to be substituted by Ukraine, Russia.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. Now, I don't think they've gone away. And there's been a very interesting, I should really do a program about this for my channel. We should do a program about it on the Duran, because there was some very, very interesting testimony given to Congress recently. And I think it's fairly obvious that there are some people in the US who have now decided that the US is going to hold on to Taiwan no matter what, because they see it as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. This all goes back, by the way, to a memo that Douglas MacArthur sent to, I think it was Eisenhower in the 50s. And, that you have to have control of Taiwan, because if China regains control of Taiwan, then the US will lose its unsinkable aircraft carrier, and the Chinese will be able to project air and naval power into the Pacific. So it's now becoming increasingly clear that the US is never going to give up Taiwan, and that they have in effect abandoned the one China policy as it has been understood up till now. And I think the Chinese are well aware of all of this. And at the moment, this has all gone into a bit of remission. But I suspect come the new year, we'll be seeing it all starting up again.
After the Olympics.
After the Olympics, yeah. Exactly. Alex has hit the nail on it. After the Olympics.
Yeah. Hickory Dickory says China doesn't respect copyright and patent laws. They just need a sample to reverse engineer and then manufacture all they need.
Yeah.
They and other Asian countries make literally all our stuff anyway.
Yeah. True. I mean, yeah. By the way, I mean, going back to the Russian-Chinese thing, I mean, that was a big issue for the Russians as well. I mean, way back in the 90s or early 2000s, the Russians sold some fighter jets, Sukhoi Set-27 fighter jets, to the Chinese. And then they were astonished to see the Chinese rolling out a copy. I mean, this caused, for a time, actually, a lot of anger and tension between China and Russia. So, what the Russians have decided is forget about copyright issues. It's not going to work. You can't beat them, join them. Let's get into joint production instead. It's one way, I suppose.
Yeah. Copyright is out the window.
Yeah.
In these cases. Hey Man says, kill the middle class and elections become meaningless. Bread and circus events. Promise of bribes for the masses will win the day among a mass of serf.
Well, to some extent that is true, but again, and I speak now as somebody who used to do lots of legal workshops around London specifically. Don't underestimate the shrewdness of working class people. Now, they're under an awful lot of economic pressure. They have limited amounts of time. They can't sit down and read long articles in newspapers. They just don't have the time to do that. But when push comes, they can be pretty shrewd. And you see that in elections. You saw that in 2016. You saw that to a great extent in 2020. They can work out ultimately what's going on. They might not get there as quickly as others do. So, but don't underestimate the shrewdness, as I said, of working class people as well. And obviously, there is, to a great extent, it's true that middle class people provide the ballast, and I can certainly see why the oligarch class says, if you eliminate the middle class, then we can easily control the working class. We can have all they do is they watch Netflix and do all those sort of things. But I think it isn't quite as straightforward as they think, and I think people are, as I said, much more shrewd and much more aware at every level of society than is widely understood. If we talk about Brexit, for example, in Britain, it originally began as a working class movement, and that's not something one should ever forget.
Yeah, Kafram, yes, says another prediction: Trump will not win in 2024 if he runs. Together with Bill O'Reilly, he pushed the jab agenda. His supporters were booing.
I know that. I understand that. I'm not going to try and predict the outcome of 2024, and I'm not going to even try and predict what Donald Trump himself is going to try and do.
Yeah, his talking point should be no mandates. That should be his talking point.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Violin Merchant says, I, for one, am done being told I am parroting Russian propaganda by people who refuse to support their arguments with evidence, especially after Russiagate.
Absolutely, completely agree. I mean, the way in which Russiagate has just been, people don't talk about it anymore. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, this topic which dominated conversation for years. Well, we don't want to talk about that, and still we mustn't call it a conspiracy theory, even though that is what it was. It was the mother and father of all conspiracy theories, the biggest conspiracy theory ever. And it was a conspiracy theory which was completely baseless, because, of course, conspiracies do happen, and it's entirely appropriate to make theories about them. But those theories must always be anchored in facts. And as you absolutely rightly say, Russiagate was not anchored in any facts at all. None. Just a sloppy dossier, which, as I said, we now know exactly how it was made. It looks as if it was orchestrated by the Clinton campaign.
Which we knew.
Which we always knew, exactly.
Yeah, which we always knew. Yeah. All right. Life of Brian says, glad I finally can catch you live again. Note that when Biden says dark winter, he is quoting a 2001 military biowar simulation smallpox attack coordinated by none other than John Hopkins.
Well, gosh. Okay. I didn't know that.
John Hopkins University.
I did not know that. I did not know that.
Maryland, Baltimore.
Exactly. He has a script writer. Biden has a script writer, because he doesn't come up with these things himself. He's got a script writer who's coming up with these things like this, and they're very, very revealing. As I said, when at the end of the summit for democracy, Biden quoted a poem by an Irish poet, which again, I know for a fact caused quite a lot of offence in Britain, and I wonder whether it was the same script writer whose coming up with those sort of things.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that he is relying on a scriptwriter. That's for damn sure.
No. I mean,
every time Biden decides to speak for himself, I'm sure
yeah,
everyone's just like
yeah.
they're like clutching at the desk, going, "Oh no, oh crap!"
Yes, but he's
got off script.
Yeah, he's got a script writer, as I said, who has some interesting, who reads in interesting things. He has an interesting sort of turn of mind, and has some very interesting. I mean, he's interested in some very interesting things. So, I mean, the Dark Winter thing is sounds quite disturbing, actually. And as I said, this poem, as I said, was very revealing. I don't think Biden understood that it would have been interpreted in Britain. It is interpreted in Britain as an anti-British poem.
He has no understanding of anything at this point.
No,
I think that's crystal clear. Toilet Sauce says that's why they like coalition governments so much.
Yeah. They like coalition governments because they can create a government like the one in Germany, which directly contradicts what the German electorate wanted.
Exactly.
I mean, that's exactly what it's all about.
Exactly. Kurt Fromm says, Alexander, with the exception of SAP of Germany, Microsoft is number 1, IBM is number 2, number 3 is Oracle, number 4 is SAP, with sales of $29.1 billion USD in 2019.
Well,
SAP is the big, but it's been around for decades upon decades. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not a new.
No,
it's not a new tech company.
I mean,
it's old traditional tech.
It's old, exactly. I mean, like IBM is. I mean, you know, I mean, the kind of tech that I was talking about. I mean, we don't have a European, a German Google, nothing like that, or a German Amazon. I mean, the Russians do, but Germany has failed to produce these things. It's something, by the way, that's regularly talked about now in Germany itself. It's, the German word angst. The Germans feel enormous angst about this. And of course, the trouble is they never make the connection with what they understand, that there's a problem. They never work out what the problem is.
Yeah. Didapong says, in terms of China-Russia collaboration, it includes Iran, main power in the West Asia, and possibly Turkey and India to an extent in the future.
Well, conceivably. I mean, we mustn't overstate things. At the moment, the clear relationship is between the strategic partnership, which we're told is better than an alliance, is between China and Russia, and which the Chinese say is far more powerful than the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact ever was, which is true. All entirely true, by the way. Anyway, that is the core relationship. Iran might eventually become integrated into that. At the moment, it's one step away from being part of that system. And of course, India has its issues with China, which may eventually be resolved, but which for the moment create a distance. But then, of course, we're going to have, apparently within a few weeks' time, a joint summit meeting of Putin, Modi, and Xi. So we'll see what that comes up with.
Yeah. I believe Alan Watson asked a question about that earlier, about Russia, the chances of Russia patching things up with India and China, acting as a mediator.
The Russians have consistently said they're not prepared to be a mediator. A mediator is somebody who passes comes up with ideas to try and sort of negotiate between the other side. Says, this is why did you concede this? Why did you accept that? The Russians have said they're not prepared to do that. But what they are prepared to do, and I think what they're doing actually, is they're acting as a bridge. They're bringing the Chinese and the Russians together into the Chinese and the Indians together into the same room, and say, look, why don't you talk together? You've got so much that you can talk about. You've got so much that you can work over, do, and we'll let you do it. And we can provide venues and things for you that will enable you to do those things. And I think that's what the Russians are doing. And I think they will continue to do that. And I think the Chinese and the Indians will increasingly talk and just try and find ways around.
Leafy Bug says, it strikes me that the European NATO allies are to the U.S. as the Warsaw Pact countries were to the USSR in its twilight years. The relationship enhances the prestige of the hegemon, but in every other way, the supplicant states are parasites. At least the Warsaw Pact countries provided a geographical strategic buffer for the USSR. What do NATO countries do for the U.S.?
You're entirely right on every point. And to answer your, I think, rhetorical question, they do nothing for the US. I mean, obviously, they're a market for US goods. They provide some degree of economic and collaboration. They enable the US to dominate international institutions. If you want to think of yourself as, the essential country, the hyperpower, the world hegemon, then you need all of this support from Europe. But it comes at an enormous cost. It comes at a cost of an indefinite military commitment, which is now becoming an increasing strain because, you've got your new powerful adversary in the Pacific, which is China. And of course, it's also an economic burden as well. Ultimately. And I think the point about the Warsaw Pact is absolutely right. So it does give you prestige. It does help you, as I said, dominate many international institutions. I mean, you wouldn't be able to run the, organizations like the IAEA or, Interpol. You wouldn't be able to have the kind of influence there that you do now because, you can always rely on your European friends, the OPCW, to vote in these places alongside you. But in terms of actual power, they are a drain.
Yeah. DJC says every day in 2022 will be a good day. Happy New Year to everyone.
I agree.
Much, DJC,
I hope so. I mean, one mustn't underestimate the hardships that people will suffer. But for us, I think we've had I think we can look forward to better times. I think the most dangerous point, we haven't quite ended it, but I can start to see, if you like, the end of this thing. Somebody put it really well, actually. I did a live stream yesterday, and somebody quoted this comment that Churchill made after one of the battles in North Africa. He said, it's not the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. In other words, just as at that time, the worst part of the war was last coming to an end. So it is for us too. We're coming to the end of this particularly difficult, really dangerous period in international relations, which began under the Clintons. And I mean, it's almost run its course.
Yeah. The man says, Alexander, I find it disturbing when people say that Obama has charisma. Charisma is important in a leader, but Obama and his charisma has done enormous damage to the U.S. What are your thoughts?
I never saw any charisma. I never saw any charisma at all. I mean, the one thing I would say is, he is, let's say it simply, he's a good-looking man, and he wears, he came across as cool and all the rest. I didn't think he was anything like a good orator. I never understood that at all. His speeches, you always had to pass them to a ludicrous degree, and quite often he was saying the opposite of what he meant. But I always found him manipulative and dishonest, and always the opposite of what he claimed to be, and I never saw any of this charisma that people are talking about.
Manufactured is what I saw in the chat. Manufactured charisma.
Very. I would add something else about him. Very cold man, and very calculating. And of course, cold people are never charismatic.
And very secretive. We really don't know much about Obama, to be quite honest.
Secretive to the point of illness. Frankly,
yeah.
It's to an extraordinary degree.
Yeah.
Also, somebody who hides. He hides an awful lot.
Yeah. Toilet Sauce says Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and his regime have turned into a threat both for his own country and Europe as a whole. Russian Foreign Ministry. The language has changed dramatically over the last few months. Yeah, that was a quote from the Russian Foreign Ministry.
Absolutely true. On both counts. First of all, I mean, I agree with that assessment. I think Zelensky, I think even Ukrainians are now starting to see Zelensky not just as an embarrassment, but as a potential danger. I mean, because it's clear that he's completely out of his depth, but also, I mean, he's now drifted into this position of extreme confrontation and belligerence, which is clearly very dangerous. But beyond that, it's also true that the Russians in 2021 became far more outspoken than they have ever been. And this has been a dramatic shift in Russian foreign policy. Remember when they used to all the time talk about the West as their partners? I mean, you don't hear that anymore.
Yeah, that's out the window. Mark Hewitt says, what political consequences will there be if Sturgeon and Drakeford do not change their tack on the lockdowns like Bojo did?
You tell me. I don't know. I mean, major problems in Britain, I expect.
I think there's going to be a lot of political consequences sooner or later for all
Yeah.
these politicians that are pushing this
Yes.
stuff. That's just my feeling on
Yes.
on things. Sooner or later, they're going to pay a price. All of them,
Of course they
across
will.
all of Europe.
Of course they will. But of course, in Britain specifically, the idea that two parts of Britain, which make up about, well, I mean, I think Scotland has a population of about 5 million, Wales, well, less than that. England is what, 45. I mean, I can't remember exactly the exact numbers, but I mean, it is massively bigger than in population terms than Scotland or Wales. The idea that Scotland and Wales can go one way against England on this issue is impossible. And I'm sure that just as people in England are utterly exasperated and fed up with this, the same is true in Scotland and Wales. So there will be a price to pay.
5.6 million. I'm seeing in the live stream.
5.6 million. There you go.
Jay DeKong's super chat says, thanks for your superb chats, Alex Alexander. Glad I found you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And Irish Partisan asks, what are your predictions for Latin America for 2022?
You know, it's an evolving thing. Now, you know, once upon a time I was very, very well informed about Latin America. I've become then I stopped being. Now I'm starting to become more interested again. We're seeing a swing, definitely a swing to the left. It might very well continue next year if Lula da Silva or someone like him wins the Brazilian elections. The thing about the Latin American left is, as I said, that it's become, as far as I can see, very much a left in the style of the Democratic Party in the United States. And they're joining this party late, just at the moment when it might be closing. I mean, they might all be, bundling to pick up where the Democrats in the US have led at the very moment when the Democrats might be on the skids. And it could turn out, I could see how it could turn out very, very difficult and very sticky for all these left-wing movements in Latin America. To be very clear, very different from the historic left in Latin America, which, if I'm going to be straightforward about this, up to the 70s, 80s, tended to be dominated in Latin America, as I very well remember, by very orthodox pro-Soviet communist parties. I mean, they were very much the sort of ideological cement of the left in Latin America. The FARC, the movement, the guerrilla movement that fought the Colombian government, for example, most people don't know this, but it was in its origins, in its inception, it was the armed wing of the Communist Party of Colombia. It was very much part of that world of traditional pro-Soviet, hardline communist movements that were very powerful in Latin America at the time. Now they've gone, or at least they've largely gone, and they've been replaced by this sort of progressive thing. And, if the Democrats sort of manage to hold things together, then I think that you will see all of these Latin American countries sort of get closer to the Democrats in the US, and we will see a sort of convergence between the two, and we'll see, Lula and people like that coming to Washington, all of these people, working together in harness. It's more likely if the Republicans come back in the US, and if the inflation problems in Latin America intensify, which I'm sure they will, by the way, that we will see the whole thing collapse, and we'll see another pendulum swing, this time towards the right.
All right. Hey Man says Germany and Japan will end any prospect of World War III when they realize Russia and China will be superpowers and their neighbors forever. These four together can offer a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Well, I mean, it's been much talked about at least I mean, about Germany especially. That Germany might one day decide to follow its own independent policies. If it's going to do that, it's got to do one important thing, which is it's got to understand that this EU system that it's created around itself, because Germany's been a major engine in it, it not only weighs it down, because it does now increasingly. I mean, Germany has benefited economically from it, but I think even that's now run its course. It's pulling it down, and it is cutting it off from its proper foreign policy options. In other words, Germany needs its own version of Brexit if it's going to follow the kind of policy lines that you're talking about. By the way, that was the point that the original founders of the AfD were making. The point about the alternative for Germany was that it was not a European policy, but a German policy based on German national interests, which was Germany as an independent power, again, creating relationships with countries like Russia, Russia being for Germany ultimately the most important relationship of all. And the AfD found it very difficult to keep focused on that. But I know that it does have some traction. It could happen one day, but I think we have to see this European thing run its course first. Now, about Japan, I'm much less well informed, to be honest. And I think the Japanese still have massive issues with China left over, not just from the Second World War, but from the period before then. And I think they have to work through those. And I think that's going to take a very long time. But again, Japan and China, I don't think Japan will ever agree to being a vassal of China. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. But certainly, I think they could develop a good modus vivendi with each other. Once upon a, I mean, it remains the case that they're very close economic and trade partners. But again, we're a long way from that. And I think that Japan, anyway, in its interests, would want to retain a relationship, a good relationship with the United States, because, of course, it wouldn't want to be dominated by the Chinese colossus. So it would want to have the hedge that a friendship with the United States would offer it. So, we'll see what happens.
All right. Irish Partisan says Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia represent the traditional left.
I agree. Yes, that's entirely correct. That is, you're absolutely right. They are the traditional left in Latin America. The left that we're seeing appear in places like Chile and Brazil and other places is not.
Yeah. Violin Merchant says opinions on John Helmer, the journalist.
Well, I think he's an extremely clever man. He is extremely well informed about events in Russia, and he writes interestingly and is an important person to follow. I don't think he's always right. That's I really have to say. I think he has a particular biases, if I can say so, which, and this is true of all of us, obviously, they inform his biases. So I don't follow him uncritically, but certainly I do follow him. And as I said, he does often write with great insight. And sometimes on some things, I mean, like, I think his coverage of Navalny, for example, has been exceptional.
Yeah, I like the fact that he covers Russia and Cyprus, Greece,
Yes, I
Cyprus as
know.
well. It's
I
an
know. I know.
interesting scope
I know.
of topics that he covers. So
Absolutely.
that's what I like about Helmer. He covers
I know.
very interesting topics.
I know. Absolutely. I agree. I should say, I mean, declaring an interest, I've met him in London, I should say. And, you know, we got on.
All right. Command Unit says, if you had to recommend Putin on a coup policy, what should it be? So far, he has left the policy to the Russian federal subjects.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, what he's done is he's basically gone along with his own scientific establishment. It's been pointed out to me also that it does also serve a particular interest, what he is doing, which is, of course, he's been very intent on rebuilding Russia's own medical and pharmaceutical industry, which was very powerful under the Soviet Union, but then completely collapsed. And this is his way of reconstructing it. So there are all kinds of you know, plots, side benefits there for him. I mean, one of the things I didn't realize until, you know, a couple of months ago is that, and until fairly recently, the kind of, I have to use such careful words, but the kind of products, medical products that we've been talking about, made by all these companies, including the one that we hear about in Russia. Until fairly recently, Russia didn't make them. It just didn't make them at all. It imported them. The Soviet Union was self-sufficient in all of this, but after the Soviet Union collapsed, that whole thing was completely ended. So now it does, and it's used the coup issue to basically rebuild that industry.
Yeah.
So...
where am I here? Raul Pinto says, is there a call between Putin and Biden tomorrow? Any thoughts on it?
Well, there is a call. I understand actually it's going to be tonight, in fact, or at least. So we'll see what it is. Now, I think Alex, or was it somebody else, got it exactly right. It's clearly part of a big negotiation. There's going to be
a possible meeting that
there's going to be another summit meeting.
That was in the,
I mean, that's clearly where we're heading. There's obviously an intense dialogue underway. So on the 10th of January, Putin and Biden are going to speak. On the 10th of January, the officials, including the militaries, are going to meet with each other. There's going to be this token meeting with the Europeans, the Russians and the Americans on the 12th of January, which the Europeans insisted on. And then there's going to be another meeting in the new year, at some point between Biden and Putin, probably after the meeting which Putin is going to have with Xi Jinping. So, you know, you can see where the direction is going. The Europeans are being cut out of all of this, and they don't like it.
Yeah. Cactus Ray, thank you for your $5 super chat. Flying Boar says, update on RT Germany situation.
Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think RT got it completely wrong. I think they wanted to create this channel in Germany, and they thought they could find a way around the German regulations, which forbid a state to own a channel in Germany. And they came up with this idea of using the satellite and basing it in Serbia and having all the back office in Moscow. And, you know, legally speaking, they may be absolutely right. They may have, you know, their lawyers may have told them this is watertight. Reality is, this isn't just about law, it's about politics. There's no way Germany was ever going to allow a channel like that. And, you know, and of course, you can come up with all these legal dodges, but in a hostile political environment, I predict all those cases will fail. What they should have done is that they should have developed their streaming services instead. I mean, Alex is much better at discussing all of this than me, but I mean, this whole project was misconceived from the outset. I mean, it reinforces some concerns, I have to say, about the way RT is run.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Why even bother with
I know.
TV? I don't get it. Anyway,
I mean, I don't get it at all.
Yeah. Hey man says Modi and Erdogan love playing all sides, but they only play themselves. Both clever megalomaniacs with huge egos to make up for their incompetence.
With the fundamental difference, of course, that India is a huge country with a vast economy, not perhaps a very efficient economy and with many, many problems, but it does carry political, major geopolitical weight. Turkey doesn't to anything like the same degree. So the kind of policy that you're talking about, Modi can play it and play it with some effect. But with Erdogan, well, it's ended up with the disaster that we're now seeing, with the lira collapsing, Turkey now looking incredibly close to hyperinflation, and with every country, all the big powers, increasingly exasperated with Turkey as well.
Yeah. 1 second. Hickory Dickory says, I don't think Putin is the monster Western media makes him out to be. That being the case, what would Russia-China partnership look like considering China's crimes against humanity?
Well, Putin is not a monster. He is very much not a monster. I mean, and you're quite right to bring up the question of crimes against humanity and things of that kind, because there's been nothing comparable. I mean, whatever is alleged about China, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about this because I've had advice about that from people who've been there, and they tell me some pretty terrible things about what's going on in Western China. There's been nothing like that in Russia. So why this massive antagonism to Putin? Well, it's because he's wanted to pursue an independent sovereigntist foreign policy for Russia. And I come back to the point I made at the start of this program when we first had this discussion about the Russia-China relationship. Initially, what Putin wanted was to be friends with the West. He never wanted to be enemies with China. But he certainly didn't want to be opposed to the United States. He actually, there were people I remember when, I used to go to Russia in the early 2000s. They were looking forward, they were hoping for the day when Russia would join the European Union. It sounds extraordinary to say this, but you actually heard people talking like this, didn't understand exactly what the European Union was. And in my opinion, they had a lucky escape. But they really thought, they didn't think about China in those days. They thought, the US was what it was all about. The West was all it was all about. I mean, China didn't even feature in those days for them. And, I don't think Putin was very different, actually. So it was all thrown away. And now, of course, we see this relationship between China and Russia better than an alliance, something which people were saying only a few years ago. It would never happen. I read so many people. I had discussions with so many people who were telling me it will never happen. The Chinese and the Russians really don't like each other. They mistrust each other. The economics don't make sense. Doesn't make economic sense for the Russians to sell gas to China. The Chinese will pay less. I heard so many people tell me this. And I always said, you're being delusional. You're not aware of what's happening on the ground. And now suddenly people have woken up to this and realized the danger. And as Alex said, it's too late. The train has already left the station.
Yeah, they're so lucky they didn't enter the EU. God, they're so lucky.
I seriously remember this. I can remember this. There was one moment when I think even the Russians at that time began to have doubts. And that was, I remember watching, I had various Russian friends, and Putin invited Barroso, who was in those days the EU Commission president, and they flew all the way to Vladivostok, the Far East and the Pacific. And Barroso was saying, oh, here we are in Vladivostok. And this is Europe too. And I remember seeing all these Russians' faces, absolutely blank faces. and you could sense the anger.
I remember being in Ukraine in 2013, and all the Ukrainians, they wanted to go into the EU so bad, and I was just like, guys, do not go. I'm coming from Greece, and I'm telling you, do not buy into this EU lie. But they just wanted to. They wanted Europe. They wanted Europe so bad, and I was like, don't do it. You're fine. You're just fine the way you are. Do not go into the EU.
Exactly.
But anyway, propaganda is powerful.
Oh, of course it is.
Toilet Sauce says, when will the twins get their Duran trademark pacifiers? Or dummies, as they are called in Britain.
Dummies indeed. We haven't got any pacifiers. At least I don't think we do on our shop. Not yet, anyway. To be honest, we don't use them very much. Actually, we are very, very lucky. We have two very calm girls. It could very well be that's because they've got each other. They sort of keep each other quite calm. So who knows? Who's to say?
Calm before the storm.
Calm before the storm. Yes. Well, I have actually heard that that when they get a bit bigger, then of course they got each other to support them. that can lead to all sorts of exciting things. Well, we're looking forward to that happening when it does.
Okay, Sandra Fain says, what needs to happen in order to off of van der Leyen? This new German government is the most incompetent ever. Seriously, hope those crooks back off of the compulsory jabs.
Well, I have to say, I think it is such a bizarre government that I wonder how long it can last. Of course, in Germany, it's very difficult when a government is formed to simply break it down. But I mean, this is a legacy of Merkel. I mean, Merkel created this very dysfunctional political landscape in Germany, and now she's left with this monster behind her, because it is. I mean, it's a sort of monstrous construct. But I wonder how long it will continue for. And I can't help but think that in a year from now, the doubts and the opposition and the resistance will grow. And be very clear, none of its leaders, not Scholz, not any of them, has anything like Merkel's political skills.
Yeah. Flying Boar says, is DW News on in Russia? Will the Russians sanction the channel?
I think it is probably.
DW does have, they have a Russian,
I
know they have a Russian site in Russian.
Sure,
I don't know if they have
a channel exactly. But, I would say this. I mean, Lavrov gave an interview a short while ago to RT, in which he said, look, I mean, we're well aware of the kind of pressures you're under, and we are obviously opposed to that. And we don't want to do this, but, if this continues with pressure on Russian media in the West, then it's only a matter of time before we reciprocate with Western media in Russia. I haven't done it up to now, but, it is coming. So we'll see.
We'll see. Let chat. Thank you for your super chat. Hunker says, the tragedy of Western perception of Putin is that in Russia, he's a moderate Republican, a la Jacques Chirac. There are far more right-wing figures there. Exactly.
You are so right.
Very true.
You are so right about this. In fact, I mean, this is a point that I would say, in fact, Putin is not just a moderate in terms of the people who on the sort of nationalist spectrum. He is a moderate in terms of how the Russian population, the critical mass of the Russian population feel about these things. Obviously, there is a minority of people who are of liberal views, a very small minority. Trouble is, people in the West, despite all of the electoral results, despite all of the opinion polls, they still think that it's that liberal minority that is representative of Russian opinion. I repeatedly have to tell people this is completely wrong.
Yeah. Hunger says, thoughts on Edward Luttwak, geopolitical analyst, historian, and a rare realist advisor in the U.S.
He was, in my opinion. By the way, we pronounced him Luttwak, so Ludwig.
Luttwak. Yeah.
Luttwak. I mean,
I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Yeah.
But I mean, he was brilliant. I don't know if he's still alive. I've heard about him for a long, long time. But he was one of the most interesting people around. I remember, for example, that he was one of the few voices that spoke out strongly against the eastward expansion of NATO, and he was also strongly opposed to the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. So, I mean, I always thought he was a brilliant thinker.
Yeah. Kurt says, what happened to the Greek Onassis family? Love your live chats. Please give us more.
Well, Onassis left a daughter, Christina, who was troubled. I mean, he's very brilliant son, apparently, got killed in an air crash. So Christina inherited everything, and she was very troubled, and then she passed away. And there's a granddaughter who I think has inherited everything. But, I mean, they're not the force in Greece that they were. Onassis, by the way, was a remarkable personality. I mean, he was never the richest Greek ship owner, and the Greek establishment, of which, by the way, I used to belong, always mistrusted him. They always found him rather a rough diamond type figure. A lot of them looked down their noses at him. But he was a very remarkable, very, very remarkable man. And but I don't think he ever really established the kind of dynasty that you see some Greeks do. His great rival, Stavros Niarchos, who was the other great shipper, and he came from a much more established Greek shipping dynasties than he did. And the Niarchos family are still a very powerful force in Greek life.
Yeah. That's where all the Greek wealth is in shipping.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Where am I here? Leafy Bug says Obama was coolly urban, a contrast to W that the electorate wanted at the time. Very true.
Yeah.
And the Leafy Bug also says, so when the Russian liberal politicians describe themselves as liberals, yet don't seem to be liberal in any way I understand it to be. This makes me curious.
Yeah, well, they're liberals, not in the Voltairean sense of liberals. The best person who writes about them, by the way, is Paul Robinson, who is a Canadian academic and who has a very good blog called Irrationality, in which he discusses the liberals very, very well and the kind of people they are. And he also provides you with extensive extracts of the kind of way these people write. And I mean, some of it is absolutely blood-curdling. And I mean, one of the things they are is anti-democrats. I mean, in a way that is really extraordinary. I mean, they see themselves as the sort of people who should be in charge. They regard the Russian population as a whole with extraordinary contempt, and they openly, I mean, it's quite, acceptable amongst Russian liberals to say that you should have a restricted franchise, that you should take away the right to vote from most of the population. I mean, it's things which even liberals in the US don't say. Russian liberals are absolutely uninhibited about saying, and they do. So, I mean, in classical liberal terms, if you're talking about, the sort of philosophies of people like J.S. Mill, they're not liberals. What they are is, first of all, fervid pro-Westerners, but also fervid globalists. And that's much more their kind of agenda. And also very, very strongly connected to powerful oligarch factions within Russia.
Neoliberals.
Neoliberals.
Yeah, Leafy Bug says, listening to your historical series about Imperial Russia and the machinations of liberals and looking at the Russian liberals of the 1990s and today, it seems that Russian liberalism historically and today is quite different. Beast from classical liberalism or U.S. liberalism seems to me a peculiar mix of perfidy, crudity, and counterproductive nationalism, Zhirinovsky. But maybe I'm missing something. What are the defining characteristics of Russian liberalism?
You are not wrong at all. You're absolutely right. One of the important things to understand about liberalism in Russia is that it is not just an elite phenomenon. It is a self-consciously elite phenomenon. There's never been any attempt to create any kind of popular liberalism in Russia. So it's not interested at all in the lives of the mass of the Russian people. And of course, it doesn't like, to a great extent, the mass of the Russian people. And as a consequence, it fears them. And it fears and dislikes them. And it knows that it has little support amongst them. So in order to gain power, and it's very much focused on gaining power, both during the period, the Tsarist era, the late Tsarist era, and in the 1990s and since, it sought power through intrigue. Because it has no other route to it. It can't win elections. So it has no real alternative. So it constantly seeks power through internal elite machinations and by trying to get the support of the West. And that immediately changes it from the kind of liberalism, classical liberalism, that you found in the West. And of course, once it gains power, it hopes to retain it through extremely authoritarian mechanisms like depriving people of the vote and things of that kind. And because it looks to the West for support to gain power in Russia, it is uncritically supportive of the West. So, if the West wants to pursue a world war, well, Russian liberals will want Russia to ally with it. I remember during the time of the Libya intervention in 2011, there were liberals who were agitating in Russia for Russia to join in the alliance of Britain, France, and the United States that was bombing Gaddafi. They actually wanted the Russian Air Force to join in. I mean, things like that.
Alan says, is the Chinese crackdown on opposition parties in Hong Kong a strategic mistake regarding opinion in Taiwan?
Well, I think if you think of it, if you think that there is a possibility of Taiwan peacefully deciding to join with China, I think it would have been a strategic mistake. But I think the Chinese have looked at the situation in Taiwan and have come to the realization that's never going to happen, that most people in Taiwan do not want to reunify with China under any terms. And so the result is that they don't worry anymore about Taiwanese opinion in that sense. The Chinese intend to regain control of Taiwan through one of two routes. Either they will put the Taiwanese in a position where they have no choice but to reunify peacefully, because otherwise they will be overwhelmed and suffocated economically. Or alternatively, if Taiwan formally tries to break away, the Chinese have made it very clear they're ready to resort to military action.
Correct. Let me pull up some more messages. 1 second. Onassis says the career politicians forget that even if Brexit was wrong, the working class pay the price for the decision more than anyone. And as the referendum voted for Brexit, the politicians are duty-bound to carry it through, even if the decision turns out to be wrong. It is still the essence of democracy, and the working class have the most to lose. The politicians forget what democracy actually means.
You are so completely right. It's a point I made repeatedly. I made it with very many people. I even went on a TV program once, and I had a really difficult conversation with one of the members of the London government, in which I made precisely that point. I said to him, what you're doing, look, there might be all kinds of economic problems and disruptions with Brexit, but democracy is, in a democracy, it's the people who are supposed to decide. They have decided what you're doing, because he was going on all the time about how people who support Brexit, many of them are anti-democrats. I said, look, what you're doing, you're the anti-democrat. You are undermining democratic choices and undermining democratic institutions. I also said to him, because he's a member of the Labour Party, that this is just before the 2019 election. The line you're taking guarantees that Labour will lose an election which we could all see was coming. This is before the election had been called. Will lose that election badly. And I remember he treated me in the most condescending way. And of course, the outcome was exactly as I said. And your points are exactly correct, at least that I share them. And they were the points I communicated to this person. My sense is that people, when they voted for Brexit, working class people, and it was the working class provided the core of the pro-Brexit electorate, they knew there would be economic consequences. But they decided that they didn't want to be part of the EU. And they decided it for many reasons, many of them which was because they saw that the EU was going in a direction they didn't want to be a part of. They also didn't like much that the EU was doing. And they also saw the effect that the EU was having within Britain itself and the distancing of the political class from the British people, which was something that they were deeply resenting. And I think they knew that there would be economic consequences, and they were prepared to accept them. In other words, they made an informed choice. And I think that is still their choice today. I've seen no polling which leads me to think that they have changed their views in any way over this. And the political class refuse to get it. They don't get it at all. They're trying now to massage the messages of the polling data. You have to go behind it to see that, as I said, ultimately, there's been no shift of views about this at all. And of course, by taking this attitude, this incredibly patronizing and condescending attitude towards the British electorate, they show firstly their true disrespect for that electorate and the fact that fundamentally they're not committed to democracy.
All right. Byronicus says self-government or sovereignty for Wales will need the support of the English people, which is only possible in a populist Britain. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, I agree again. I mean, by the way, I mean, it is notional. It's possible to see Scotland as an independent country. It's much more difficult for me to see Wales succeeding as a standalone independent country. And certainly, if that were to happen, it would need a lot of support from England. And for that to happen too, England would, I mean, it would have to be a different England from the kind of structure that we see today. So, I mean, I think you're right. I personally still find it difficult to believe, by the way, that an independent Wales is on the way. But then, anything is possible, I suppose.
Yeah. Davil says Obamacare killed the moderates in the Democratic Party. Manchin is pretty much the only one that remains. If West Virginia goes red, the Democrats' future will be dimmer yet.
I think that assessment is very good and very right, actually. I think not only did it kill the moderates in the Democratic Party, but of course it empowered the radicals to an extraordinary degree, because they said if we can do this, then we can do more.
The man says, hey, Alexander, have you read articles on just how successful the Cuban manufactured medications have been? What are your thoughts?
I have read articles about this. Always, of course, one has to take this with a giant pinch of salt. I mean, I can't, I'm not going to jump and say, that's right or that's not. But, they've done it. They've produced these things. The stories are that they work. Maybe they do.
Yeah, and we have to be careful what we say.
We have to be careful.
Yeah. Let's see here. Onassis, just for the record, I've liked Putin and supported him for the past 20 years. I like leaders that lead for the good of their country. Those leaders can be forgiven for making mistakes too.
Well, of course they can, and Putin has made many. But I mean, the reason he still has a critical mass of support amongst Russians is for exactly the reason you say. I mean, there is a widespread perception in Russia that he is the country's leader who cares about the country, and people identify with that. They remember, after all, a time in the late 80s and 1990s when they were led by people who didn't care about the country, and they don't want to go back to that.
Alan says, guys, when will we have a live chat again? Soon, Alan. Soon after the new year.
Yes.
We'll get them going.
I would reiterate again, one of the issues, what we haven't, is that in the run up to Catherine, my wife, giving birth, and to the childcare responsibilities that I have at the moment, with two very young babies, it's difficult sometimes to find the time for things. And those kind of live chats are demanding. I mean, they do demand a lot. But, that period is ending. Come the new year, it will be different.
And Alan says, can Biden survive another year? And Harris?
Well, I would have thought not, but then I have this terrible memory of what I've said many times about the EU.
They don't have anybody to replace them.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's what you said, Alex, when they're talking about bringing back Hillary.
I mean, if you take a step back and just think about it, they're actually considering Hillary again. What more do you need?
What do you need exactly? Yeah.
Oh boy. Amrit asks, Japanese firms are today to a far greater degree reliant on their Chinese market business than on any American one. They would oppose their government moves.
I agree with that. I mean, I think ultimately Japan is now so heavily involved in the Chinese economy that an outright rupture would be so disruptive that the Japanese business community, which is incredibly powerful politically, would be strongly opposed to anything of that sort. But that points towards a policy of coexistence and even peace. It doesn't talk to a policy of realignment. I don't think Japan is looking to realign with China. I think that it will always remain on very good terms with the US, because at the same time it is wary of the growing power of the Chinese dragon. And I think that is something that they will always do.
Danish 1200 says, what do you think about Simon Tisdale at The Guardian? Until 2001, 2003, he was against the Iraq War, a lone voice in Britain at the time, along with Robert Fisk. But now, so anti-China, really disappointing. What say you?
I prefer not to talk about Simon Tisdale. I find him an absolute ludicrous figure, to be honest. I mean, I believe Rachel Maddow was opposed to the Iraq War all those years ago. I mean, I'm not sure that's true, by the way, but I mean, but if so, it seems to me it's exactly the same with Simon Tisdale. He's now got himself into a position where he's the foreign affairs editor of The Guardian, and he's become the most extreme neoliberal, neocon, hardliner on China, on Russia, on everything, and I mean, advocate of war against Syria. I mean, he is, for me, a disastrous journalist.
Yeah. A couple of more here. Alan says the gangster clique in North London that runs Labour do not care for anyone but themselves and the BBC.
I agree with that. I also think that they have very little understanding of what goes on outside England, outside London. I mean, I really, truly do. I don't think they have any idea at all what goes on in places like Newcastle, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, not to mention, the mining towns and those sort of places. And they're running Labour to a North London agenda, which, of course, they will spend all their time with each other. They're convinced is popular across the country. And in fact, emphatically, it isn't.
Yeah. Paulie says New Year's Eve fireworks are forbidden in the Netherlands. What about other countries, I wonder?
Well, what indeed? I didn't know that.
I don't know if they're allowed here. I don't know. I don't think so.
Oh, really? In Cyprus?
I think for this New Year's in Greece
Oh,
they're
right. Okay. Well, they're certainly allowed here in Britain because we've been having lots of them recently. I mean,
okay.
not just. I mean, obviously we haven't got to New Year, but we had them over Christmas. We had them on Halloween. We had them on Guy Fawkes Night. This is very bizarre festival which the British celebrate in November. So we have lots of things like that.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it, but I will now, Paulie. Thanks for reminding me. That's interesting. Renee says, what do you think about Twitter censorship of Dr. Malone? Please, we've panic.
I think exactly. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre things could ever have imagined, and it is only explicable by blind panic.
Yeah. That's everything.
Wow. That's fantastic. Everything. Fantastic. What a brilliant way to end the year.
Let me just look for some more questions. Keep talking, Alexander. If I
mean, it's amazing way to end the year. But can I just say, I mean, I should say that my wife recently, because she's at home, she spends a lot of time following the live streams, and I mean, she's absolutely mesmerized. And she's a top, big academic in both an American and a British university. She says, the quality of discussion and questions you get on these live streams is phenomenal. And can I just say, they are my favorite thing. I mean, much prefer them to anything else I do in terms of the work we do for the Duran. I mean, they're just wonderful. Getting all these questions, coming up with these questions, and as I said, to have them end like this, it's somebody who's talking about having a nice party. Well, I'm sure I will have a party, but this is if you like a fantastic first course for that party. It puts me in a wonderful mood. I feel energized after them.
Okay, we've got a couple more here. What do you think of David Icke?
Oh goodness, I don't follow him exactly, and I've heard lots of things about David Icke, and for all I know, they're all malicious. I've learned to be extremely careful before I assume that when people talk about someone, it's true. So I mean, I'm just not going to say.
The only comment I'll say is that he strikes me as someone like Alex Jones in a way, in that everyone says, okay, it's conspiracy, but then after a certain amount of time, whatever he said seems to come true. Yeah, so
it completely turns out.
I know more about Alex Jones than David Icke, but that's how he strikes me. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah. Justin Perez says it was announced yesterday that fireworks were banned in Greece this New Year's. Yeah, we're going into a big lockdown period or some sort of lockdown period. We're already in one, but it's going to get worse.
Which is, of course, what Greece needs, like a hole in the head, frankly. I mean, this is an economy which is in a total collapse, and now you're going to kill what's left of it, it seems to me.
When you go into a supermarket now, you have to double mask it. Double. I don't. Why
stop at 2? Why not have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20? Why not have a complete gas mask, and why not distribute those and have those all over the country and have everybody wear them?
Honestly, I think at this point, the people that are making decisions are just kind of toying with us in a way. I think they've gotten to the point where they're just they're trolling us.
Absolutely.
Let's see if they'll go for 2 masks.
And what were the jabs all about then? I mean, what's the point of them in that case? If you have to now wear 2 of these things,
I think 3. They're just kind of saying, or someone in the Greek government has maybe has too much inventory of masks and he has to unload them,
or he's friends with someone who makes them,
and they want to sell more.
Exactly,
which something like Greece, that. I'm sure it's something like that. Yeah.
Of course, in Greece, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. What country do you believe will ultimately break the EU financially?
My own view, and I said this very grudgingly, I think that if there's going to be a revolt in the EU, I used to think it might be Italy. I've become extremely doubtful about this. I thought that most Italians haven't, don't feel angry with the EU, but I think the political class in Italy makes that all but impossible. It might be France. France is a complex, unpredictable country, and it has a revolutionary tradition. And I know that there is disaffection and dissatisfaction in France at a level I've never seen before. I also have to say, I think increasingly it could be Germany, actually. I'm hearing lots of things from people in Germany. For many people in Germany, the election has been a catalyst because, as I said, they've ended up with the opposite type of government to the one they voted for.
Yeah. Raul Pinto says, prepare for financial disaster in 2022, warns forecaster Gerald Celente. Thoughts?
Lots of people talk about this. What I'm going to say this is, I mean, we now see, I think I'm right in saying that Alex follows the markets more closely than I do, that the financial markets are now at absolutely record levels. And I mean, I just don't get that. I mean, you know, we are looking at an inflation crisis. We are looking at, we've had deepening recessions. We're having real problems in the economies. And there is a fundamental detachment, it seems to me, within the financial markets at the higher end from the underlying situation in the economies. Now, I'm not saying all shares and stocks are overvalued, or that if there's a crash, everything will collapse and there'll be a total implosion. I still don't believe that. But a major fall in the markets of some kind, I would have thought was possible. Alex, you follow these things much more closely than me. What do you think?
I can't. You know what? Not financial advice.
No.
With each day, I go more into crypto now.
Yeah.
To be honest,
I mean,
just because of two. Well, real quick, one or two connected reasons. It's constantly online, and it's just easier to go in there and do stuff.
I know. I think
that's pretty much it.
I mean, I think you need to be. I mean, that's the other thing to say. I mean, I just don't. I mean, I follow so much news that I just don't have the time now to follow everything, and the sort of gyrations in the financial markets are. I've never been particularly engaged with that sort of thing anyway, but you know, I sense that, you know, this is becoming increasingly unreal now. I may be right, I may be wrong, but
when you get a company like Facebook with the value that it has, and you scratch your head and you think, what the hell do they even make?
Yeah,
I mean, that's when you know things have kind of.
What value? What is the value added? I mean, that's what I find difficult to understand.
Yeah.
Now, and that it seems to me it's based on policies that are being followed by the administration and the Fed, which to my mind are unsustainable anyway, for all sorts of other reasons we've talked about.
All right, we got some more questions that came in, Alexander. What do you think of Drakeford banning civil servants from using words like HM and Brexit? Just proves the politicians have lost the plot.
Well, absolutely, of course it does. And can I just say, if we're talking about Wales, I mean, look at the vote in 2016 in the Brexit referendum in South Wales. How are you going to tell those people who voted overwhelmingly for Brexit there, these working class areas, places that used to be strongholds for the Labour Party, that you know, a Labour government in Cardiff is going to say, you know, civil servants aren't allowed to use the B word? It's just delusional.
It's crazy. Yeah.
It does tell you a lot about the visceral hatreds that these people have. I mean, they detest Brexit. They don't just oppose it; they loathe it. Quite why they have such a complex about it is another question.
Leafy Bug says, my hope for 2022 is that a critical mass of the population will realize the negative consequences of the Mexican beer sickness do not justify the authoritarian measures our governments have undertaken in order to contain it, that the cure is far worse than the disease. The gap between the media catastrophe and whatever more people are seeing with their lying eyes is widening. Is the pretext for emergency measures sustainable for much longer? I write this as a parent who doesn't want their children growing up in fear.
I don't think it is. As I said, my overwhelming sense in Britain is that the British population is fed up. And I did a program on locals in which I went through some of the polling data on this, and it says the same. I mean, this isn't just my gut feeling, which I had before I saw the polling data. The polling data confirms it. They've had enough. And I think if people persist in this and try and come up with more things, they're going to run into more and more opposition. It was Voltaire, I think we said, when the people begin to reason, all is lost. And I think we are at that point now with this thing.
DL says, have you heard any updates about China-Russia moon base?
No, I haven't. I mean, there is a space program. Now, the Chinese have a well-organized space program. The Russian space program has been a mess, to say it straightforwardly. It's been run by all sorts of odd people, and it's taken a very long time to get back into shape. Now, I get the sense that things will begin to come together. Now, I get the sense that some of the better people will start to, the better people are finally being brought in. But I mean, this moon base idea is certainly something that's some distance away. And it depends, obviously, on developing heavy lift rockets. Now, both the Chinese and the Russians have programs for this, but they're still some years off.
Yeah. Okat says Carl Bildt, Swedish neocon.
Yes. What more to say? I mean, also, by the way, I mean, I think he was Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, architect of the Ukrainian crisis, commentator, studio guest, enthusiastic Twitterati. You see him everywhere. He's all over the place. And it's quite amazing to see how, somebody can be consistently wrong about everything and can wreak disaster and havoc in his way and still manage to be all those things.
Always. Dr. Bill says, America is not a democracy. It is a constitutional republic. My high school in Philadelphia, Central High School, was the first public high school in America, founded in 1846. It has the motto, School of the Republic.
That is absolutely correct. It is first and foremost a constitutional republic. Because it is a constitutional republic, it could evolve into in democratic directions. To be very clear, a monarchy is much more difficult, but a constitutional republic could take that process much further. What we're seeing in the United States is that it's precisely that constitutional republic which is under attack and which is being dismantled. So you see the attempts to rearrange the electoral system, the attack on the Electoral College, the attack on the Supreme Court, the attack on various provisions in the Constitution. And by doing that, by undermining the constitutional republic, you will undermine those elements in America, those structures which made democracy possible.
Yeah. Paul Woking, UK, says David Icke has been a guest on Alex Jones's show a number of occasions. Thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't want to say this. I don't want to talk about somebody I know very little about, and I'm certainly not going to do it on the basis of what his critics have said, given who his critics are. I mean, maybe that some of the things they say about him are true, but I'm not going to take that on trust.
Yeah, look at his critics, exactly. Danish1200 says, regarding Japan, China has so much feeling over the last 100 plus years. Japan war memorials to Tojo leadership, sticks in China's craw, no real close alignment until serious apologies, and pretty much want Japanese kowtowing.
I think I think that's true at the moment. Whether it will always be true is another question. But certainly, I don't think there's going to be a realignment. And look at it also from Japan's point of view. Putting aside now the history, you are a major power, big industrial base, big scientific base. You're a trading power, but you have a colossus on your doorstep. You want to make sure that you can hedge against it, because otherwise the relationship becomes dangerously uneven.
All right. Ernesto, thank you for that super sticker. Awesome. Thank you very much. And Jay DeKong says, wishing all the best to the Duran team for the new year and happy new year to all on the chat. See you next year. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Jay DeKong. Happy new year to you as well.
Yeah.
Definitely see you next year. And Heyman says, ordered Roman Revolution last night. Very excited. Thanks for the recommendation.
Okay.
Happy New Year's, Alex Alexander. You're the best. Viva Duran.
Thank you very much.
Viva la vida, Duran. Thank you very much. Let's see, where are we here? Viva la vida, Alexander. Toilet sauce. Have you been following the MH17 kangaroo court case?
Yes, and I'm not going to say more about it than you've just said in your question, because that is exactly what it is. It's a case with a predetermined outcome. That's all I get to say about it. I mean, if you want to get a real deconstruction of it, go to the latest interview by Lavrov.
And John Danujit says, Lenin said Germans were incapable of successful revolution. I would agree.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What he said was, and he said many things, but the thing I've always liked, a particular comment he said, was that the Germans, before they storm a railway station, will queue up to buy tickets. So that was his comment about the Germans.
And Karen Desch says, at what point will German business decide to pitch in with Russia for energy security and China, the largest market?
This has been talked about so much. People have always expected that, eventually the German business community, which, by the way, detests the sanctions, would exert itself and would say enough's enough. And one knows that there's a lot of disaffection and rumblings below the surface. It's never really manifested itself in any decisive way. The reason was that they've always, up to now, depended on the CDU-CSU. They've always been very closely linked with the CDU-CSU. And of course, when the CDU-CSU was led by Merkel, they didn't want to go against Merkel. Now, of course, they have a completely different government now, and maybe that will galvanize them to take a bigger, stronger stand than the one they've been taking up to this moment. Certainly, the fact that Nord Stream 2 is there, full of gas, and in the middle of an energy crisis, they can't tap into that gas, and the fact that their bills are rising, and that the German car industry is essentially stagnant as a consequence, that can't make them feel very happy about the situation. But we'll see what they do. As I said, it's been much talked about that they would assert themselves eventually. Up to this moment, they haven't done so.
And Life of Brian says, when Kyle or O'Keefe get any justice from the court, it feels like a miracle. I don't see how we advance without a mass purge of corrupt judges.
Well, purge is a strong word. Clear out, perhaps.
Yes. Drain the swamp. All right. That's everything. That's Alexander. Everything. We got questions from the chat. We got super chats. We got locals questions as well. Just a lot of great questions and comments. Indeed. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for those comments and those questions. And of course, we have to thank Cosmic Rain, Alan Watson, Valley S, Reckless Abandon, GEC 812. And yes, those were, and all our great moderators, Spartan, Warrior Queen, Zariel. They keep everything moving along.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they make all the difference, actually. I mean, these live streams become very, very difficult, all but impossible without them. So we're really grateful to you.
Very grateful to them as well. And they deserve a big round of applause, a big smash of that like for all the moderators. And Yethna P says in a final super chat, for the new year, I hope to see you collab with Nick of Raketa Law. That's a great channel, Raketa Law. Alexander, check it out. And also do a show with Inner City Press, who was kicked out of the UN for exposing them.
Okay, we will definitely.
I will look them up.
Look them up.
Thank you very much, Yetha, for that. Final words for the end of 2021, or words of encouragement, Alexander, for 2022, as we are all nervous as we enter what many feel will be a difficult year.
It will be difficult. It is, but look, let's think about the situation a year ago. I mean, it looked like there was an unstoppable juggernaut in the US, and that was certainly the appearance of it. And it hasn't turned out like that. The administration, we never quite thought that ourselves, but the administration has disintegrated faster than anybody, I think, imagined. And not only that, but the whole project has gone wrong. And they're becoming nervous, they're panicking, they're frightened. And I feel that we're not quite over the worst yet, but we're coming to the end. I think 2022 will be a much better year than 2021, at least in terms of its prospects. It'll be very hard because we have the inflation, we have the remnants of the coup. I don't think we will see a war in Europe. I think we will see some kind of settlement. In fact, that's my own personal view. I'm not sure what form it will take. I don't think we will see a war in Europe. I think NATO expansion has run its course. I think we're going to start seeing NATO fold in on itself. And I think that the whole unstoppable juggernaut has ground to a screeching stop, that it's now going to start falling backwards.
We will leave it on that note, Alexander. Good words of encouragement. Remember, everybody, he is called the Oracle of London. So keep that in mind. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great remaining 2021. Have a great new year, 2022.
Absolutely.
And get some rest, everybody. And we'll be back.
We'll be back in the new year.
Take care.
Take care.